For a moment, silence reigned, both literal and mental, as Zorian stared into the unblinking eyes of his adversary. Zorian wasn't one of those people who had a phobia of spiders, but it was hard not to be intimidated by a creature that could read your thoughts and have you completely at its mercy due to induced paralysis. He couldn't even try to physically overpower the effect, since the paralysis was a purely mental one. He was quite literally locked out of control of his own body. The situation wasn't completely hopeless. As a mage, Zorian was resistant to mind reading almost by default. The ability to clear away stray thoughts and emotions, and otherwise discipline their mind, was a must for any aspiring mage. That said, controlling your thoughts for long periods of time was tiresome. It was only a matter of time until a stray thought escaped him and he slipped an important secret to the blasted spider. And resistance to mind reading would do him no good if the creature grew frustrated with his resistance and decided to take a metaphorical sledgehammer to his mind. In the end, the spider decided to speak first. Or rather, communicate telepathically to him first, as that appeared to be its only method of talking to him. It made sense, really. The spider had no recognizable mouth from which to speak out of. "You're untrained," the spider opinionated. "It's a pity. I would have loved to trade techniques with a human psychic. I suppose it's to be expected, though, considering the unhealthy attitude towards mind magic your species has." What? Zorian's brain froze for a moment. Him, an empath? That was ridiculous. He was neither social nor pleasant enough to be empathic. What a strange chain of thought, the spider mused. Arania like me are all open, yet there are plenty of loners and unpleasant individuals among us. I'm sad to say that some even use their empathy to purposely promote discord within the web. Zorian's mind was momentarily aflame with possibilities before he forcibly reined himself in and shoved those trains of thought into the back of his mind. Focus. This was a horrible time for getting distracted. He had a far more serious issue to think about. You must be mistaken, Zorian thought back, knowing that the spider would pick up on his thought. It's far more likely you accidentally attached some of your emotions to the telepathic message you sent me. There is no need to be insulting, the spider immediately sent back. I am an Arania Matriarch. If I had attached something other than speech to our communication, it wouldn't have been by accident. But never mind. If you want to deny the obvious truth of your empathic abilities, I'll play along for now. What I want to know is what your quarrel is with my web. As far as I know, we've never done anything to you, so I'm baffled as to why you felt the need to sick the enforcers at us. What was she? The warning he gave Taven to watch out for telepathic spiders and the subsequent search for the creatures by the enforcers. Right. Of all the things he had been worried about during this past week, having the spiders track him down for setting enforcers at them had never even entered his mind. Funny how these things worked. I'm not sure if you'll believe me, but I never intended to send the enforcers after you, Zorian sent. All I did was warn a friend to watch out for you when she went to the sewers. It all seems to have spiraled away from there. Why wouldn't I believe you? I am literally reading your mind as we speak, the spider noted. But that still doesn't explain how you even knew about us. We tend to be a tad secretive. Or, for that matter, why you felt the need to warn your friend to watch out for us, since we don't really attack humans without provocation. Well, crap. How can he possibly explain that without revealing anything sensitive? I suppose this is something related to this time loop you're trapped in, then, the spider asked innocently. Zorian would have grit his teeth if he could. Damn it, how? He pointedly didn't think about that. Your ability to control your train of thought is fairly impressive for an amateur, but it is a form of mental defense that only works if you know your mind is being read. I observed you and your group for quite a while before I executed this ambush. And while you are open, and thus hard to read covertly, your friend and sister are virtually defenseless against my powers. They didn't even notice while I was trawling through their memories, much less when I skimmed their surface thoughts. Zorian felt like slapping himself for such an obvious oversight. Of course, sharing his secrets with the likes of Kiriel would come back to haunt him. A secret is only as secure as its weakest link. He considered the situation for a moment before giving a mental sigh. It was hopeless. The spider had completely outmaneuvered him, and currently had him over the barrel. The creature seemed reasonable enough, but he would have almost preferred that it was murderous. He could recover from death easily enough, but the things a skilled mind mage could do to him would linger with him on subsequent restarts. Your insistence on viewing me as an uncompromising threat despite no hostile moves on my part is honestly getting rather tiresome, the spider sent, and Zorian detected a distinct note of annoyance in her bearing. Zorian idly wondered how the esteemed matriarch would describe her current ambush and her gross violation of his friend's privacy if not as hostile. I came here to talk, not fight. The enforcers hadn't even managed to track us down, much less dispatch any of us, so there is no reason for hard feelings on my part. This isn't a revenge run, it's an attempt to defuse a situation before it spirals out of control. I know our kind looks frightening to your eyes, but please stop thinking of me as some slavering beast out to eat you or some sadist intending to torture you into insanity for absolutely no reason. We're no worse than humans, really. I'm not sure that sets me at ease. Humans can be pretty horrible, Zorian noted. But I see your point. So what now? The enforcers will get tired of their search quickly enough and leave you alone, and I have no intention of taking any further action against you and your web. Problem solved, then. Well, yes, the spider agreed. But in the process of confronting you I found something 100 times more interesting than a human kid with a grudge. You don't really think I'm going to just ignore the whole time loop business, do you? I was kind of hoping you would, actually, admitted Zorian. It's not really your concern. Oh, I beg to differ, the spider interjected. I just found out I'm being effectively memory wiped in regular intervals. I am greatly concerned. Zorian racked his brain for a response that could dissuade her from getting involved but gave up after a couple of seconds. He was getting an impression of resolve and stubbornness from the spider, and had a feeling all of the arguments he could marshal were doomed to fall on deaf ears. He didn't know how he could read a giant spider's body language, but apparently he could. Maybe there was something to her claim of him being empathic. Look, Zorian tried. If we're going to have a serious conversation about this, I would really appreciate if you released me from paralysis. This is very uncomfortable and I'd be a lot friendlier if I weren't frozen like this. I don't trust you that much, the spider told him bluntly. All you have to do is scream and things could get uncomfortably messy. I'm not going to do that, Zorian assured. That would just put my sister and friends in danger. I'm sure you could handle anything anyone in this house could throw at you. Well, I'm not. I've lived too long to underestimate mages, the spider said. Tell you what. Though. Why don't I simply let you go for now and leave? Later. When you calm down a little. You can descend into the city tunnels and track me down for a nice friendly chat in neutral territory where we both feel a lot safer. That sounded like a great idea. Actually. Well. Except for the question of why. Why would you bother tracking me down when you can just pretend this never happened and ignore my existence entirely, the spider surmised. Well, for one thing. I can tell you're interested in what I mean by you being open. No matter how hard you try to hide it. You will never get a satisfactory answer unless you seek me out. Secondly. There is a reason why I accepted the idea that you're trapped in a time loop without dismissing you as crazy. I have important clues that could help you solve this puzzle and break out of the loop. But I'm not sharing them until I get something in return. I'm sure we can agree on a fair price. And finally. Working with me isn't just going to be an unnecessary chore like you seem to think. I am a leader of a shadowy group of mind-reading spiders that have their feelers throughout the entire city. Surely you can see how a group like that could be useful in making sense of this event. Zorian swallowed heavily as he finally realized the seriousness of the situation he was dealing with. Her group was that big and organized. He knew the spider before him was a representative of a larger group since she introduced herself as an Urania Matriarch. But he thought it was just a loose pack consisting of a dozen spiders or so at best. Suddenly the pitch-black eyes staring at him seemed a lot more threatening than they were just a moment ago. Gods! What had he gotten himself into? I'm glad we were finally able to understand one another. Zorian Kaczynski. Rest now. And we will talk when you're less tense. Zorian suddenly felt a smothering blanket of telepathic force press itself gently but firmly against his mind. He tried to resist. But the mental attack seemed to ignore his mental defenses entirely. Despite valiant efforts, Zorian soon blacked out. When he woke up a few minutes later, he was alone in the room and there was no trace of giant spider anywhere in the house. Afterwards, Zorian thought long and hard about the matriarch's offer and ultimately decided he really didn't have much choice. He somehow doubted she would patiently wait for him if he ignored her for too long. And raising a fuss about her actions would attract unwanted attention to him and might cause the matriarch to retaliate out of spite. And since she knew about the time loop, she was bound to pick something that would haunt him beyond the confines of this particular restart. Of course. There was also the fact that some of the things she said during their brief exchange interested him greatly. The potential benefits of hashing out a deal with her were simply too great to ignore. That said, he had absolutely no intention of rushing to the damn spider at the earliest opportunity that would just make him seem desperate. Let her wait for a while. It was a good idea to do some preparations before confronting the matriarch. Anyway, first of all, he needed to know more about these Urania he would be meeting with. His previous searches for information about the spiders left him empty-handed. But now he was armed with an actual name of the species and his search was much more successful. He found plenty of descriptions, though they were of much poorer quality than he had hoped. Apparently Urania were considered semi-mythical due to their rarity and there were many conflicting reports circulating about them. Everyone agreed they were sentient and magical in nature. But from there the details diverged wildly. Depending on the author, all sorts of powers were attributed to them. From the ability to assume human form to the ability to manipulate shadows and other crazier abilities. Zorian could see three possible explanations for this. 1. The Urania had a dizzying number of subspecies, all with a wildly different appearance and abilities. 2. The authors were making stuff up. And 3. The Urania were mages in the human sense, armed with a flexible spellcasting system capable of producing a wide variety of effects. Knowing his luck, it was definitely number 3, the most worrying of possibilities. A group of one-trick ponies limited to mind magic was a dangerous foe, but one that could be countered with enough preparation. A group of mages utilizing a completely novel spellcasting system whose limitations he was unfamiliar with. That was practically the definition of unpredictability. Still, the Urania he had met never gave any indication of knowing any magic beyond the mind-based one. So maybe this group specialized in the field or something. Having a way to deal with their mind-affecting abilities was certainly a must before going off to confront them. One of the books also suggested Urania were vulnerable to light-based attacks, being nocturnal in nature and lacking eyelids. It sounded plausible to Zorian, and he was pretty sure his spell formula skills were sufficient to cobble together some flash grenades. A few more general defensive measures and he should be set. Well, as set as a mage of his own caliber and resources could possibly be, it wasn't much. But it would hopefully buy him enough time to flee if things turned sour. The other thing he was trying to puzzle out was the matriarch's claim that he was an empath. The idea seemed so wrong to him. The stories he'd heard about empaths painted an image of a compassionate, sociable person possessing great wisdom, respect for tradition, And lots of friends. Zorian didn't really fit this mold. Did that prove anything? Though. Empaths were so rare among humans. At any rate, that any sort of fact about them was suspect. As strange as it may sound. He rated the opinion of a giant telepathic spider higher than those of human authors. If he really was an empath. However. Why didn't he know it? You'd think the ability to sense other people's emotions would be very obvious. He supposed it was possible that his abilities were too weak and erratic to manifest themselves in an unambiguous fashion. Which raised the question how to discern the truth. Then. Fortunately. Empathy wasn't a particularly sensitive topic, so nothing stopped him from asking Ilsa or other teachers for help and information. Before he did that. However. He decided to try looking for help closer to home. He had noticed their landlord had an interest in esoteric branches of magic. Even though she wasn't a mage herself. She had enough books in her house to stock a small library. It wouldn't hurt to ask. He supposed. And Amaya was a lot more approachable than anyone else he could reach. He approached her while she was washing the dishes one evening. "Miss Kurashka. Could you spare a minute?" he asked. "I'd like to talk to you about something." "I told you to call me Amaya," she said. Halting her task long enough to give him a mild glare. "And of course I can talk to you. But I have to finish this first. Pull up a chair and wait till I'm done." Instead of doing that. However. Zorian moved to help her with her task. She'd be done quicker with him helping her out. And it was a cheap way to score some points with her before asking for help. She seemed momentarily surprised by his gesture. But recovered her composure quickly and continued on as if his action was totally expected. Once they were done. Amaya sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for Zorian to join her. "So," she began. "What exactly is weighing so heavily on the mind of my grumpiest tenant that he would come to me for counsel? The way you've been avoiding me this whole time. I almost thought you hated me." "I don't hate you. Miss K. Amaya," finished Zorian. Correcting himself after seeing her cross look. "I've just been pretty busy. That's all. Kiriel kind of monopolizes all of my free time here. She is quite a handful. Isn't she?" Amaya said speculatively. "Still. I can't see what a busy boy like you would want from me. You aren't trying to seduce me. Are you?" "What?" "No," sputtered Zorian. She was at least twice Zorian's age. "For heaven's sake. I am not." He stopped himself when he saw the barely restrained mirth emanating from Amaya. "Very funny. Miss Kurashka," he deadpanned. Deliberately not calling her Amaya to spite her. Very funny." "It was from my perspective," Amaya said. Laughter dancing in her voice. "But I can see you don't take jokes at your expense too well. So let's just move on to the reason you sought me out." "Well," started Zorian. Pointedly ignoring her remark about him being too sensitive about jokes. "It's actually magic related. I noticed you have a lot of books about esoteric magic in your home." "It's a hobby of mine," Amaya said. "I always did have an interest in magic. Especially the rare kind. I even went to a mage academy as a teenager. Much like you did. That's how I met Ilsa. Actually, we were classmates back then. But that was a long time ago." Zorian nodded. Accepting her last statement for what it was, a request not to pursue that topic further. He was fine with that. "So I assume you read all these books then?" he asked. "Each and every one of them," she confirmed. "Did any of them perhaps relate to empathy?" Zorian asked. "Specifically. How can you tell if you're an empath yourself?" "I did read something about that topic. Though I don't have the book in question here with me." She gave him a curious look. Why? Fancy yourself an empath? Well, maybe, admitted Zorian. I mean, it doesn't sound very likely to me. But I met an actual empath recently. And she seemed sure I was one too. So I don't feel comfortable with just dismissing the possibility. Amaya hummed. And why do you think it's so unlikely if you've been told that you're one by another empath? Shouldn't empathy be pretty obvious to the one who has it? Zorian asked. Well, it's not obvious to me. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that would indicate I am one. Nothing? Amaya asked curiously. I find that hard to believe. The indicators of being an empath are so common and mundane that false positives tend to be a major problem. In fact, a lot of experts insist that there is nothing supernatural about empaths, that some people are simply a lot better at reading people's body language and environmental cues than most of humanity. It's far more likely that you're just ignoring the signs. For instance, can you honestly say that you've never had an instinctive feel about a person you just met? Well, no. I can't say that, Zorian admitted. I get feelings like that all the time. That isn't anything unusual. Though. It might be, Amaya said. Just how often do you get such hunches, and how reliable are they overall? Zorian hesitated. I get those feelings pretty much every time I talk to someone. They tend to be pretty accurate from what I can tell. Why? Is that so unusual? Amaya gave him a speculative look. A bit. Yes. Every time you talk to someone, you say, how about random strangers minding their own business? Do you get these feelings about them too? Sometimes, admitted Zorian, shifting nervously in his seat. Some people have really intense personalities. You know. You can pick them out of a crowd from the other side of the room without even trying. Interesting. How about groups of people? Can you make a spot judgment about the mood of a group without speaking to anyone? Well. No, said Zorian. Frankly. The pressure crowds out all other sensations when I'm in a large enough group. If I'm subjected to it long enough, I lose even the ability to make judgments about individuals. Much less the group as a whole. The pressure? Amaya asked, giving him a baffled look. It's a personal problem, fumbled Zorian. Every time I enter a big enough crowd, I feel this weird mental pressure that gives me a headache if I stay inside long enough. Zorian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hated telling people about the pressure thing, since most people immediately assumed he was either delusional or making things up. His family, for instance, had never believed him when he tried to describe the phenomenon to them as a child, believing instead that he was making things up so he wouldn't have to follow them to their various social events. Eventually they grew tired of his claims and threatened to send him to a madhouse if he didn't admit he was lying. So he never brought the issue up again. That's an interesting problem, Amaya said carefully. Tell me. Is the pressure constant or does it vary according to some criteria? It varies, said Zorian. The more people there are in a crowd and the more densely they're packed, the stronger it is. It's also stronger if the crowd is. He trailed off as he suddenly realized something. Gods. He was so stupid. Yes. Amaya prodded. If the crowd is what? Emotionally charged for some reason, finished Zorian lamely. A short silence descended on the scene, before Zorian rose from his seat and began angrily pacing around the room. Your empathic abilities are so strong that you literally feel the emotions of a crowd as tangible mental pressure bearing down on you, said Amaya after watching him pace around for a while. And you think there is nothing to indicate that you're an empath? It's not that easy. How was I supposed to know what the pressure was? Zorian protested, nervously running his hand through his hair. It's just there. It has always been there. A constant annoyance that was with me ever since I was a child. Do you have any idea of the sheer amount of trouble this thing has caused me? Isn't empathy supposed to be a boon? Most of the time I did my best to ignore it, vainly hoping it would go away in time. Well. Yes, Amaya agreed. Empathy is usually depicted as a great gift to the person who has it. But there are plenty of reports of empaths whose powers are so strong or volatile that they are crippled by them instead. Considering some of the horror stories I've read about, your case is relatively mild. It could have been worse. It could have been worse, that could easily serve as a summary of his entire life so far. Oh well, there had to be a way to rein in his errant empathic abilities somehow. And he had plenty of time to find it. The Urania probably knew how. Though he suspected he wouldn't like what they would ask in return. Zorian? Amaya asked after a few moments of silence. I can see this is a somewhat sensitive topic for you. But can I ask you a question? Well. 2 questions really. Sure, agreed Zorian. She did end up helping him. Even if he didn't imagine her help to play out the way it did. So the least he could do was satisfy her curiosity. I get the feeling that you didn't like the idea of being an empath. Even before you knew what you do now, she said. Why is that? Maybe I am projecting somewhat. But I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to possess an inborn magical ability. I hope you don't think you're a freak just because. No. No. It's nothing like that, Zorian quickly assured. I know a lot of civilian-born students react badly to anything that may make them abnormal, but I'm not like that. No. The real reason I didn't like the idea of being an empath is far more stupid than that. Actually, I'm kind of embarrassed to even admit it. So can we just move on? No, Amaya said. A smirk on her face. This I definitely got to hear. Zorian rolled his eyes. Serve him right for admitting it was embarrassing. Oh well. It's not like she'd remember this conversation once the loop reset. All right. But you can't tell this to anyone. Okay. Amaya mimicked sealing her mouth shut. It's because empathy is usually portrayed as a feminine ability. One reserved for girls and girly men, admitted Zorian. Ah, nodded Amaya. Of course a boy would be bothered by something like that. I'm not sexist or anything, Zorian hastily added. But I already receive a lot of comments about my supposed lack of masculinity. And they're annoying enough as it is. I really don't want to see how bad they would get if they had this sort of proof. His family was the worst offender in that regard. Especially his father. But he would keep that little tidbit to himself. I won't tell anyone, Amaya said. And if it makes you feel any better. There is no evidence that empathy manifests itself more often in women than it does in men. I figured, Zorian said. Very few magical abilities are gender-specific. Unless they're artificially designed to be that way. And I also think those people have no idea what they're talking about, Amaya said with a supposedly innocent smile that had a hint of mischievousness behind it. I think you're a very handsome young man who will someday make some girl very happy indeed. Thanks. What was the other question you wanted to ask? Again, said Zorian. Trying to change the subject to something less embarrassing. She had her fun. No need to torture him further. I assume you will try to develop your ability further? Amaya asked. Zorian nodded. In that case, I'd like you to keep me informed about your progress. I find stuff like this incredibly interesting. Zorian agreed. Though it was essentially an empty promise. She would remember none of this after the next restart. Their conversation done. Amaya returned to her household chores and Zorian went back to his room to plan his visit to the Urania. He really didn't want to find out what the Matriarch would do to him if he didn't show up soon. Well. This is it, Zorian said out loud. Standing in front of the entrance to the sewers. The matriarch didn't tell him where exactly in the sewers she hoped to meet with him. But he knew where he had met the spiders the last time he had been down there. So he intended to start from there. The point of no return. I once again offer you the chance to turn back. You don't have to risk your life with me. Kale. He gave a pointed look to the Morlock following after him. Trying to use his newly found, newly recognized empathic abilities to gauge the other boy's mood. Sadly, the boy's emotions were too well controlled at the moment and his control over his empathy sucked. Regardless of how Kale truly felt about this trip, he was clearly determined to see it through. Why? Zorian didn't know. When he told Kale about the Urania Matriarch's ambush and the resulting conversation, he did it because he wanted to have someone to bounce ideas from, and Kale seemed like the best choice. He already knew about the time loop and he was clearly very intelligent. Not because he had wanted Kale to come with him. Kale, on the other hand, insisted that coming alone on such a meeting was the height of idiocy and that Zorian needed a partner to cover him. Zorian reluctantly agreed. Not entirely comfortable with risking someone else's life in this thing. No matter how logical it was. Kale seemed amused that Zorian cared more about his safety than his own. Considering that Kale would be restored to normal once the loop restarted and Zorian might not be. But Zorian's moral sense had yet to adapt to the implications of the time loop and he was horribly bothered by the idea of leading Kale to his death in the tunnels and leaving his daughter all alone in the world even if it was only for a week or so. I told you to drop it, Kale sighed. I'm definitely going with you. If nothing else. Then so this Urania Matriarch and I can have a conversation about ethical uses of mind magic. Oh right, Kale was still kind of bitter that the spider searched through his memories in her quest to piece together what Zorian's motives were. Finally, they descended into the tunnels. Zorian leading the way. He chose his way carefully. Occasionally leaving a magical trap behind them in the form of stone cubes covered in spell formula. If they had to flee, the traps should be able to surprise any pursuers by backtracking where the traps were. Most of them simply erected a force field to delay the attackers. But a couple had more aggressive effects. At the very least it should force the pursuers to slow down in order to deal with the cubes and give them enough time to reach the surface. Kale, meanwhile, was their anti-mentalist support. He had put a mind shield spell on himself. And would remain under the spell's effects constantly. If the meeting at any point turned sour, Kale would immediately cast the spell on Zorian as well. Kale seemed sure that the spiders had a method of communicating with humans other than telepathy and suggested that they both use the spell right from the start. But Zorian knew he had to keep his mind open if he wanted these talks to be in any way productive. His instincts, which Zorian now recognized as his uncontrolled empathic abilities, were telling him that Urania placed great significance on mind-to-mind communication. Shutting them out completely would be seen as an insult. Even if they did happen to have alternative methods of communicating. As they approached the spot where Zorian had first met the Urania during his romp through the sewers with Taven and her group, he felt a telepathic contact brush against his mind. Like the first time he had met the sentient spiders. This one was cruder. More forceful than the featherlight touch the matriarch had displayed during her visit to Amaya's home. A stream of psychedelic images and alien emotions hit his mind like a sledgehammer, causing him to stumble back in shock. Kale immediately shifted into defensive posture but Zorian signaled him to stand down. He was pretty sure at this point that the Urania he was in contact with had no hostile intentions. Apparently the minds of humans and Urania were different enough that telepathic communication was difficult. And this particular one never learned how to do it correctly. As suddenly as it came, the communication stopped. The presence remained. However, And Zorian soon felt another Arania connect with him, using the first one as a sort of telepathic relay. Ah. So you've managed to find us in the end, the distinctive mental voice of the Matriarch spoke in his mind. Good. I was beginning to fear I should have left instructions on how to find us. Stay where you are. Please. I will be with you shortly. She's coming, said Zorian to Kale, who nodded gravely. They didn't have to wait long. The Matriarch soon skittered into view, flanked by 2 other Arania guards. The fact that he was able to pick out the Matriarch among the 3 Arania, despite the fact that all 3 of them were fairly identical to his eyes, was probably just another proof that he really was empathic. Things like these made him wonder just why he had needed a talking spider to point it out to him before figuring it out. I originally intended this to be a private talk between just the 2 of us, the Matriarch spoke to his mind. But since you saw fit to bring a guard, I decided to do likewise. Oh well. At least you didn't shut me out of your mind like your friend did. So you're still better than most humans I converse with. Kale isn't here just as a guard, Zorian said, speaking out loud for Kale's benefit. He is involved in this thing as surely as you are. And I'd like him to participate fully in the discussion. Do you perhaps have a way to communicate vocally for his benefit? The Matriarch seemed to consider it for a moment before she suddenly started waving 4 of her front legs in front of her, tracing some complex gesture in the air. Zorian tried for a moment to decipher what she was trying to communicate before he realized she wasn't trying to talk to him. She was casting a spell. There, a feminine voice declared from the direction of the Matriarch, though her mandibles didn't move at all. This is the Arania equivalent of the magic mouth spell that you are no doubt familiar with. It's just a sonic illusion. But it should be enough. Ha! So they did have more than just mind magic in their arsenal. I thank you for your consideration, Kale said guardedly, obviously threatened by the spiders but trying to stay polite. Far from me to refuse such a simple request, the Matriarch said guardedly. She was obviously a little suspicious about Kale herself. Probably because his mind was protected behind a mind shield spell. The spell made him immune to her abilities. But it also seemed to paint him as a threat to the Arania. Please. Child, the Matriarch scoffed. Zorian heard the words with his flesh and blood ears. But he also felt them broadcasted to his mind. She might be vocalizing her words for Kale's benefit. But she clearly wasn't going to give up communicating with Zorian the proper way. I could get past your silly human mind magic any time I wanted to. No. The reason I'm bothered by his mind ward is that it blocks me off from his mind completely. How am I supposed to trust him if he won't even let me read his emotions and surface thoughts? It's rude. Zorian's mind boggled at the mindset that considered putting your surface thoughts up for scrutiny as being basic courtesy. But he supposed that species differences for you. Kale didn't appear to be as understanding. Rude, he demanded, indignant at the accusation. You think you have a right to just barge into people's minds as you please. No permission given or asked. And you call me rude? You spied on my personal memories. Damn it. I have every reason to protect myself. The Matriarch sent him a telepathic equivalent of a sigh, though no sound was vocalized for Kale's benefit. So did I, she said calmly. Your friend was a possible enemy that I needed to know more about. And you were one of the weak points I could target in order to get the needed information. Your mind was completely unprotected. After all. So why didn't you sift through Zorian's memories? Then. Wouldn't that be quicker and more relevant to your quest? Kale asked. Hey. Zorian protested. I have limited myself to skimming his surface thoughts as a courtesy. Because he is open, the Matriarch said. Among Arania there is an unofficial custom to ask for permission before delving deeper into the minds of non-enemy psychics. Regardless of species. Kale narrowed his eyes. And if a person isn't psychic? Flicker minds are fair game, the Urania Matriarch said dismissively. All right. Let's stop trying to piss each other off now and get back to business, said Zorian with a clap of his hands, hoping to halt the argument before it got out of hand. We were talking about the time loop and how you can help me with that. Before we get to that, though, I really have to ask, when you say I'm open, are you referring to my empathy? Kale gave him a surprised look at that. Since Zorian never told him anything about being empathic. Being open implies being empathic. But they are not the same thing. Empathy is just one of the powers available to you. And a bit of a low-hanging fruit at that. That's why you can use it. Despite being completely untrained in the psychic arts. Openness often manifests itself as a low, uncontrolled empathy in the beginning, coupled with a gift for divinations and an occasional prophetic dream. What? Fumbled Zorian, trying to wrap his head around this new information. Just when he had thought he had things a little figured out, something like this happened. What the hell is being open or psychic? Then, was she saying he was a full-blown telepath or something? You could be that with enough training. Yes, confirmed the matriarch. I can teach you more about it provided we come to some kind of mutually acceptable agreement about this time loop business. And what exactly do you want from Zorian in that regard? Asked Kale suspiciously. Why? My dear Kale. The same thing you want from him as well, the matriarch said with a hint of mockery. I want in on this time loop. For a moment Zorian wondered what she was talking about. But then his eyes widened as he understood what she meant. You want to keep your memories with each restart? To loop around with me and Zack? Asked Zorian incredulously. Kale shifted uncomfortably in his spot, refusing to look at him in the eye, while the Urania matriarch stared straight back at him without a hint of shame on her face. I guess I can see why you would want that, said Zorian hesitantly. I mean, I'm not too happy about my situation. But even I can see that I'm benefiting massively from it. But you seem to have gotten the wrong idea, both of you. He glanced at Kale. But the Morlock was still avoiding his eyes. He probably thought Zorian would be angry at him for wanting to take advantage of him. But Zorian wasn't really angry. Just confused. The thing is, I don't know how to bring anyone into this loop. I don't even know how the details of how I got sucked into it. Much less how to replicate it. I can't bring you into it. We didn't get the wrong idea. Zorian, Kale sighed. We're not stupid. We know you can't do it now. We know you won't be able to do it by the time this time loop ends. He gave the matriarch a weak glare. Or at least I know. Maybe the great Urania matriarch knows something this poor flicker mind doesn't. I agree with the Morlock, the matriarch said, refusing to rise to Kale's provocation. It is highly implausible that you'd be able to bring us into the time loop as you are now. You've completely lost me at this point, Zorian complained. What do you want? Then? My idea was to store memory packets in your mind, allowing your soul to ferry them when the time resets itself, the matriarch said nonchalantly. It's not quite as good as having your entire soul sent back. But it would be good enough for my purposes. And I would agree to that. Why? Asked Zorian suspiciously. That sounded like it would require some serious messing with his mind. Far more than he was comfortable with. In any case, I'm sure I can find something to tempt you with, the matriarch said, punctuating her message with a mental shrug. You need information about the loop that I have. You want to learn how to control your empathy. You need my help in countering the invaders. Need I go on? Zorian sighed and turned to Kale instead of answering her. I wanted to connect you with some people and have you figure out, with their help, how your connection with Zack works. Then you could apply that knowledge to bring me into the time loop, said Kale. It would probably take quite a few restarts. And I don't have anything nearly as tempting as our esteemed matriarch over there. But on the other hand, it is something that will definitely help you learn more about this time loop in the process. Left unsaid was that those people Kale wanted to connect him with were probably all necromancers, and that having them mess around with his soul was every bit as dangerous as letting the Urania screw around with his mind. And possibly more so. I see, sighed Zorian. Well, I'll set aside Kale's proposal for now. Since that's not what we came here to discuss. That's fine with me, Kale said quickly. I still have a lot to think about in that regard. Right, said Zorian. Then let's move on to the details of the Matriarch's proposal. Just out of curiosity. Do you have a name? If we're going to do business. Especially so sensitive. I'd like to know who exactly I'm talking to. The Matriarch didn't answer verbally. Instead, she sent a short burst of telepathy containing the same sort of psychedelic jumble of images and concepts that the less skilled Urania bombarded him with in the initial greeting. Thankfully, this particular burst wasn't painful. Just confusing, probably because it was so relatively short. After mentally dissecting the chaotic message in his head, he realized this was the name he asked for. Translating the concepts into something appropriate for human communication proved a bit of a challenge. However, Spear of Resolve striking straight at the heart of the matter, questioned Zorian curiously. As good an approximation of my real name as any, said the Matriarch. And yes, I know that's too unwieldy to use in human conversation. Your language is very crude. So it's hard to translate Urania names into it without ending up with such overdramatic sounding drivel. You can just continue calling me Matriarch and I won't hold it against you. Kale snorted derisively at the Matriarch's swipe against human speech. But didn't say anything. Zorian, for his part, was considering how to proceed. All right then, said Zorian. You told me that there is a reason why you took the time loop seriously. Why don't you tell us what you mean by that? Before the Matriarch could answer, a loud roar pierced through the relative silence of the tunnel, quickly followed by several more similar ones. Color drained out of Zorian's face as he realized the identity of the creatures that produced the roar. A band of war trolls were coming their way. He should have known. Really, every time he got even slightly closer to getting to the bottom of this mess, some complication sprang up to hamper his progress. It was uncanny. He was half tempted to conclude the, as of yet unconfirmed, third time traveler was messing with him. But he would have expected something far more decisive than a pack of war trolls if that were the case. And now that he thought about it, it was kind of scary how radically his perspective must have shifted during the last year if he started considering troll war bands a nuisance rather than an existential threat. Not this again, the Urania Matriarch complained telepathically. How do those things keep finding us? I had the whole web warded against divinations and everything. Zorian filed in the back of his mind the fact that this wasn't the first time the Matriarch encountered the war trolls. But at the moment he didn't really have enough time to consider that little tidbit in any appreciable detail. He exchanged a knowing look with Kale. And then they both turned around and started running in the direction they came from. Zorian motioned for the Urania to follow after them. And received a thought of assent from the Matriarch in turn. We can't outrun them, the Matriarch noted as they ran. Especially us Urania, aside from short bursts of speed. We're actually a lot slower than humans. It's fine, Zorian thought, certain that the Urania would pick up on it. Me and Kale prepared a couple of surprises for pursuers behind us. They should slow the trolls down enough for us to reach the surface. Ah. An insurance against me in case the talks turn sour, the Matriarch surmised. You hit it well from my surface scans. I would have been caught totally off guard if I had truly planned to double-cross you. Then again, I don't think I could have caught up to you if you decided to run anyway. So it was mostly a wasted effort. Or would have been. Had there been no war trolls. Information on Arania running speed is a tad hard to come by in human books, Zorian thought irritably. Slowing down to let the Arania overtake him. They were just about to pass the first trap and he didn't want to seal the Arania on the other side of the force field along with the trolls. Can't you use your mind magic to pacify those things? The war trolls rounded a corner in a tightly packed mass of green flesh. Howling like lunatics and waving their huge swords and maces around like they were twigs. But Zorian was ready at that point. He sent a pulse of mana into the pair of nearby cubes covered with sigils and a sheet of force sealed the corridor. It wouldn't last long if a bunch of trolls kept beating at it. But he never counted on it being an insurmountable obstacle in the first place. Sadly, whoever is controlling them has learned to shield their minds against us after the first few conflicts, the Matriarch said. It's not foolproof. But we won't be able to pick their defenses apart before they smash us into pulp. There was a terrible racket behind them. And Zorian chanced a glance back to the barrier to see what was happening. The sight that greeted him brought a pleased smile to his lips. The trolls had apparently failed to arrest their momentum properly and ended up crashing headfirst into the barrier. Probably because the relatively narrow corridor didn't allow the trolls to advance in a single line and the ones in the back didn't let the ones in the front break up the mad charge. Or maybe they just didn't recognize the force field for what it was. No matter. The point was that they were currently all tangled on the floor in a great big confused mass. And would take some time to reorganize. That should give them enough of a lead to escape cleanly. Even with the slowpoke Arania weighing them down. Just to make sure he activated the next two barrier traps as well. But the two cubes holding explosive traps he simply scooped up and took with him. They were weapons of desperation. Truth be told. And he wasn't sure if he could activate them without blowing himself up along with the target. Besides, he was pretty sure they didn't have enough power to seriously damage a troll. Being designed to handle much squishier targets. Zorian was worried about how they were going to smuggle a trio of giant spiders past the entrance guards. But he needn't have worried. The Arania seemed to be able to edit other people's senses in real time. Effectively erasing their presence to the victim. Zorian had to admit he hadn't thought the Arania's mind magic was quite so subtle. It would appear he was still taking them far too lightly. But anyway. They were back on the surface and totally safe. He hadn't expected the whole thing to end so favorably. When he realized a pack of trolls was coming after them. He fully expected he was heading for an early restart. It seemed good things did happen to good people occasionally. Still. As happy as he was at his current fortune. His talk with the Arania wasn't finished yet. So the four of them quickly relocated themselves in a deserted alley to continue their conversation. We should be safe enough to talk here. The Matriarch said in her magically assisted voice. I can't sense the presence of any minds that don't belong here. Not even those blasted cephalic rats. The what? Asked Zorian. Another psychic creature we've recently come to share this city with. The Matriarch groused. They look much like regular rats. Except the top of their head looks like it has been sawn off. Leaving their brains visible. Oh. Zorian said. I actually saw something like that once. Back in my original live-through of this month. I never went down that street in any of the subsequent restarts. Though. Probably for the best. The Matriarch said. It is likely they are working for the invasion forces. They only appeared recently and the trolls started harassing us when we tried to exterminate them. Are the rats intelligent? Asked Kale. You seem to be implying they're some kind of spies. Yes. They are psychic. Like us. The Matriarch said. Their minds are telepathically linked to one another. forming a collective intelligence. Individually, they are little more than particularly cunning rats. But the more of them group together, the smarter they get. And the stronger their telepathic abilities become. They're small enough to get anywhere, and the death of any particular rat is inconsequential. Each one acts as a relay for the full power and intelligence of the entire swarm. They're almost perfect spies. Better than even us Urania. As I said, we tried to get rid of them before they could muscle in on our territory, but we failed to account for the fact they weren't working alone. Crap. Zorian said. With those things running around the city, it's no wonder the invaders are so well informed. They could be pulling information straight out of people's minds without anybody realizing it. All they need is to find one person that is privy to sensitive information and whose mind is unprotected. And they can blow a hole in the whole system. Yes. The Matriarch confirmed. Urania can do something similar. But not nearly to the same extent. We're too big to move as freely through human settlements as cephalic rats do. And our individual members are not as expendable as individual cephalic rats. They can get into many places where we can't. Especially warded ones. Giant spiders trip defensive wards in ways that a couple of funny-looking rats do not. Zorian frowned as he suddenly realized something. With these cephalic rats on the loose in the city and working with the invaders, there was no way the invasion organizers remained ignorant of the time loop in every single restart. Zorian himself had not advertised his situation much. But Zack did. Sometimes very visibly and explicitly. If Zack hadn't been speaking in hyperbole when Zorian talked to him. So whoever was controlling the cephalic rats knew about Zack being a time traveler in at least some of the restarts and never did anything about it. Zorian found that difficult to explain. Did they just refuse to believe what their agents on the ground were telling them? That sounded uncharacteristically sloppy considering how well the invaders seemed to be organized otherwise. An interesting point. The Matriarch said. Breaking him out of his thoughts. I'm beginning to understand why you're so reluctant to deal openly with this Zack. But we're getting distracted here. Dancing around the real issue. You heard my offer. Zorian. I have been very generous about my information thus far. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to put my foot down now. I want a straight answer. Will you let me send a memory packet through you or not? Zorian sighed. What a difficult question. He wanted needed what the Matriarch was offering, but he really didn't trust her with this. And really, how could he? Mind magic was only a hair's breadth better than soul magic in terms of abuse potential. And that was only because mind magic had well-established counters whereas soul magic did not. You're asking a lot. Zorian complained. I offer a lot. The Matriarch countered. And besides, I'm taking as big of a risk here as you do. I have no guarantee that you will actually track me down in each restart and alert me to the memories I stored inside your mind. What stops you from playing along for a few restarts? Until you've gotten everything you wanted from me. And then meticulously avoiding contact with me for the rest of the time loop? Nothing. I have taken a leap of faith and decided to trust you. Is it so wrong to expect a similar commitment from you in turn? A short silence descended on the scene as Zorian digested her words in his head. He supposed there was some merit in what she was saying. Though he wasn't quite buying the idea that she was risking as much as he was. His risk was more final and immediate than hers. Oh well. No pain. No gain. Fine. He said. I agree to your terms. You are a braver man than I. Kale told him as they slowly walked back to Amaya's place. Zorian absent-mindedly rubbed his forehead instead of giving him a proper answer. He didn't feel noticeably different after the Urania was finished with the procedure. To be honest. Kale was worried about possible dormant command spells that the Matriarch may have implanted along with the memory packet. But I actually had a reason to think it might not be as dangerous as it sounded. Zorian finally said. Oh. Kale prompted. Yeah. I researched the limitations of mind magic before we went to talk to the Matriarch. Both the classical spellcasting type and the telepathic abilities of magical creatures known to use them. I even asked Ilsa and our combat magic instructor for advice. I probably made them really suspicious of what the hell I'm doing, but whatever. Anyway. Everyone seems to agree that even expert mind mages can't just rewrite someone's brain on a whim. Or in a stealthy manner. It takes a great deal of time, and you basically have to knock the victim unconscious, or they will be fully aware of what you're trying to do to them and fight it with everything they got physically and mentally. If the Matriarch tried to do something truly terrible to me, we would have known quickly enough. I'm not really sure I could have done much for you. Even if I noticed the deal had gone bad. Kale said. I do have some modest combat skills. But I doubt they'd be enough to fight off 3 giant spiders that are all within jumping distance of me. It doesn't matter. Said Zorian. Reaching into his pocket to retrieve one of his 2 unspent explosive cubes. He held the stone cube in his palm so Kale could see it. All I had to do was send a pulse of mana into these, and both me and the Matriarch would have ended up in pieces. I very much doubt the Matriarch could have incapacitated me faster than I can pulse my mana. Suicide? Kale asked. Sounding surprised. He shook his head. I stand by what I said. You are a braver man than I. As Zack once told me. The time loop skews your perspective on dying. Said Zorian. Putting the cube back in his pocket. Now that he thought about it. His impromptu security system reminded him of the similar system that protected Zack from the Lich's soul meld spell. He should probably start carrying something like this all the time. Just in case. Something way lighter and less noticeable than 2 big stone cubes. Though. It's still possible she used something less comprehensive than a full personality rewrite on you. Though. Kale said after a few seconds. I know. Zorian said. But you heard what she said at the end. The memory packet should last for a year. At minimum. I plan to avoid the Urania in the next several restarts while I look for a way to examine my mind for such things. Even if the magical expertise is beyond me. I'm sure I can find an expert to hire so they can take a look at me. Ah. Good idea. Kale nodded. Of course. That means it will be a while before you can question the Matriarch again. She did say she wasn't saying anything until you deliver the memories to her reborn self in the next restart. An acceptable delay. Zorian shrugged. It wasn't like he had nothing to do while he waited. And Zack had indicated he would be spending the next several restarts in Scioria as well. Hell. Even in this particular restart he had to see what Hazlush would do about the invasion and what Zorian could do to help him. If he ended up staying in Scioria during the summer festival at all. That is. He wasn't sure he wanted to do that. All things considered. So do you want to tell me your master plan for getting yourself into this time loop now or later? Later. Kale grumbled. I haven't even ironed out all the details in my head yet. Stupid spider and her big mandibles. I'm pretty sure her speech didn't involve mandibles in any way. Actually. Zorian said. It was a pure sound illusion. Really? Wasn't my mind shield spell supposed to protect me from mind effects like illusions? Even if they're beneficial? Asked Kale. Frowning in confusion. The Matriarch spell wasn't targeting your mind. It created actual sound waves. Said Zorian. But then it's a sound spell. Not an illusion, no. Kale stated more than asked. Officially. Any spell that creates fake scenery is an illusion, regardless of the means it uses to do so. Many illusions are made primarily out of actual light and sound. But they're still illusions. That's surprisingly imprecise. Kale said. I understand it's because a lot of actual structured spells from illusionary disciplines combine mental illusions with, well, let's call them physical ones. Theoretically, you could separate the two into different categories. And many tried. But in the end the Eldamar Mage Guild decided to just admit defeat and lump them together. How surprisingly practical of the guild. Then, Kale said. I guess even they get an attack of common sense from time to time. Zorian said nothing. He didn't need empathy to deduce that his Morlock companion had a bit of a grudge against the guild for some reason. Personally, Zorian thought the Mage Guild was doing a pretty good job overall. But he wasn't so impressed with them that he would defend them in front of others. The rest of the walk passed in relative silence. As the start of the summer festival approached, Zorian became more and more certain that Hazlush wasn't going to do much about the invasion. He wasn't sure whether the man had decided Zorian's suspicions were merely a rumor or whether he was ordered to drop the issue. But he no longer seemed very interested in the whole matter. For Zorian, this was a sign that he should take Curiel and get out of the city before the invasion starts. He had no interest in getting murdered by the invaders again. And even less in having Curiel die alongside of him. He would have to see whether he could talk Kale and Amaya into leaving with them. But although the date was fast approaching, such problems weren't a pressing concern yet. Currently, he just wanted to have something to eat and lie down a little. Kirathishli had given him some truly mind-numbing tasks to perform today. And he wasn't in the mood for plotting. Conveniently, the moment he walked into the house he was assaulted by the smell of food wafting from the kitchen. Amaya's insistence on keeping her informed of his comings and goings was somewhat annoying. But Zorian had to admit it was convenient how she timed her meals to match his and Kale's schedule. He entered the kitchen and was immediately tackled by Curiel. "Brother! I hurt my hand," she wailed, waving her hand in front of his face. "Hurry! You have to heal it." Zorian snatched her wrist to stop her from moving her hand so much and inspected the grievous injury. It was a shallow cut, a scratch really that would probably heal on its own by the end of the day. Out of the corner of his eyes he could see Amaya trying not to laugh. Zorian suppressed the urge to sigh. He knew his family would make fun of him if they knew he was an empath. But he honestly didn't expect Curiel to descend to this level. She knew he wasn't a healer. Association between empathy and the healing arts notwithstanding. Though considering his excellent mana shaping skills, he would probably make a good healer with enough training, something to consider. At least, schooling his face into a serious expression. He slowly turned Curiel's injured hand this way or that, pretending to study it in detail. Finally, after a thoughtful hum, he looked Curiel straight in the eye. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done, miss. We will have to cut it off," he concluded gravely. He then turned towards Kana, who was sitting at the table but studiously watching the entire exchange, and gave her a deep, meaningful look. "Fetch the saw." Kana nodded seriously at him and motioned to leave the table, only to get stopped by a laughing Amaya who assured her that he was just joking. Zorian was pretty sure the little girl understood that all too well and was just playing along. Did they even have a saw in the house? In any case, Curiel wrenched her wrist out of his grasp at his declaration and pouted at him. "Jerk!" she declared, sticking her tongue out at him. The meal was relatively quiet, except for occasional outbursts from Curiel. But that was Curiel for you. She was a loud person by nature. Though Zorian was pleased to say she did have calm periods from time to time. mostly when she was reading or drawing. It still surprised him a little every time he saw her do that, since it seemed rather out of character for someone like Kyrielle to be so absorbed into a book or a drawing. Doubly so because he knew from personal experience that mother and father didn't think much of hobbies like that and tried to discourage them as much as possible. After the meal, Zorian retreated back to his room, Kyrielle following after him. Zorian didn't feel in the mood to chase her off and let her, but she seemed to be in a fairly agreeable mood today and left him largely at peace. He was currently sitting cross-legged while practicing his shaping skills, while Kyrielle was lying on her stomach and drawing something on the floor. A small pile of papers scattered around her. Eventually, though, her pen stopped moving and she spent the next several minutes nervously chewing on the tip of it. Zorian was versed well enough in her tics by now to know his peace and quiet would end soon after. "Zorian?" she suddenly asked. "Yeah." He sighed. "Why do you study so hard?" she asked, giving him a curious look. "Even though nothing really matters in this time loop you're stuck in, you still keep working all the time. Don't you want to have fun from time to time?" "You're wrong," Zorian said. "First of all, everything matters. You are what you do. And if I were to start doing stupid things just because there is seemingly no consequence for them, those actions would eventually come to define me. Secondly, I actually find studying fun. Well, maybe not all of it, but you get the idea." There was a short silence, but Kyrielle seemed reluctant to continue the conversation, even though she clearly wanted to say something. Zorian decided to help her out. "Why do you ask? Is there something you would rather be doing?" Kyrielle's eyes darted between him and the pile of drawings on the floor several times, before she finally reached a decision. She scooped up the papers into a neat stack and promptly plopped into Zorian's lap. "Can you look at my drawings and tell me what you think?" she asked excitedly. Oh. Well, that wasn't too bad. He never paid much attention to her drawings, especially since she tended to hide them whenever he tried to get a better look. But from what he had glimpsed they were pretty good. Hell, he was feeling in a good mood so he wouldn't even mock her too much. Damn. Zorian watched and listened in silence, and Kyrielle animatedly showed off the fruits of her labor, explaining what the drawings represented. Not that she needed to do so, because the drawings were frighteningly realistic. She wasn't just good, she was freaking amazing. Zorian could swear he was looking at drawings of a professional artist rather than some childish drawings of his little sister. One of the drawings was a very detailed scene of Scioria's cityscape that was so chock full of little details that Zorian was shocked Kyrielle actually had the patience to put them down to paper. Never mind, draw them properly, Kyrielle. Those are absolutely amazing, he said honestly. He had intended to make a few jabs at her skill at first, but he honestly couldn't see anything remotely worth mocking in these. Why on earth is mother not bragging to everyone about having a budding little artist for a daughter? Kyrielle shifted uncomfortably in his lap. Mother doesn't approve of me drawing. She won't buy me any supplies and she yells at me whenever she catches me doing that. Zorian gave her a baffled look. What? Why on earth would she do that? Mother was close-minded and status-obsessed, but not actively malicious or anything. He picked up Kyrielle's stack of drawings and leafed through it again, stopping at a very nice portrait of Byrne, the boy he and Kyrielle interacted with on the train to Scioria. Kyrielle had never even seen the boy after that day, yet she was able to create a very faithful rendition of him, presumably by working from memory alone. Wait, he said suddenly. Is that why you keep stealing my notebooks and writing supplies? Ah. I thought you didn't even notice, she admitted, since you never complained about it to mother. Thanks for that. By the way, Well, he never said anything because he thought Mother wouldn't do anything about it. Even if she knew. But hey. All was well that ended well. And he certainly wasn't going to tell Kiriel the truth and destroy whatever gratitude he just earned. What about the books? Then? I suppose she disapproved of those too? Zorian guessed. Yeah. Kiriel said, clutching her drawings close to her chest. She won't buy me any. She says a lady shouldn't waste time with such things. That he actually expected. Truth be told, Mother didn't like it when he spent his time reading. So he imagined she would be none too happy to see her darling daughter picking up such a hobby. Still didn't explain why she didn't want Kiriel to draw. Though. Well. That's Mother for you. Said Zorian. She seemed to be getting rather upset. And Zorian could totally understand. It would appear her situation had more similarities to his own than he had ever dreamed about. Don't worry about it. It was the same with me at first. She'll lay off once she sees she can't bully you into submission. It's not the same. Kiriel suddenly snapped at him. Now what? Kiri. You don't get it. It's not the same because you're away from home most of the year and she can't do anything to you while you're away. You and Daimen and Fortov are here. Learning magic and doing whatever you want. And I'll never get to do that. She buried her head in Zorian's chest. Her tiny little fingers digging painfully into his arms. It's not the same because I'm a girl. Zorian wrapped his arms around Kiriel, rocking her gently to calm her down while he digested what she was telling him. Finally, a realization hit him. Traditionalists in Siren often held a view that educating female children was a waste of time and money. Hell. Some of them even went against the law and refused to send their daughters into elementary school to learn how to read and write. It didn't help that mage academies tended to be rather expensive. Even lower quality ones. They aren't going to send you to a mage academy, Zorian concluded out loud. Kiriel shook her head. Her face still buried in his chest. They say I don't need it. She said. Sniffing sadly. They already have a marriage arranged for me for when I turn 15. Well, isn't that nice for them? Said Zorian coldly. You know what? Kiri. You're right. It's not the same. I had to defy mother and father all by myself. You. On the other hand. Have me. Kiriel peeled her face from his chest and gave him a searching look. You never wanted to help me before. She accused. Every time I asked you to teach me magic you blew me off. I didn't know what you were dealing with. Zorian shrugged. I thought you were just impatient and didn't want to waste my time on something you were going to learn in due time anyway. But rest assured. If mother and father don't change their minds over the years, you will always have a teacher in me. She stared at him for a few seconds before she snatched one of his arms by the wrist and gripped it in an oath-making position. Promise? She asked. Zorian squeezed her hand tighter, eliciting a yelp from her. Promise. He confirmed. 2 days before the summer festival, Kale finally laid out his plan to Zorian. It was a lot less concrete than the Matriarch's one, and basically involved talking to a number of individuals that Kale thought might know something about soul magic or time travel. None of them were in Scioria, though, and would require Zorian to basically blow off school in order to travel across the country, and in some cases even across borders. The Morlock also hinted that he knew a couple of individuals living in the Great Northern Forest. But he admitted it might be a bad idea to visit those until he could actually defend himself properly. Zorian memorized the names and locations. But it would be a while until he could visit any of them. The end of the restart was totally uneventful. Kiriel. Kale and Kana boarded the train heading out of Scioria on the night of the festival and spent the last remaining hours playing card games to pass the time. Imaya refused to go with them, which was fairly unsurprising, given the suddenness of their request and the sketchy nature of their warnings. And then, like always, Zorian woke up in Siren, Kiriel wishing him a good morning. He didn't take her with him this time, which turned out to be a good idea, as Zack did indeed come to class in that particular restart. The other time traveler tried to strike up a conversation with him, but Zorian was determined to avoid him and gave him a cold shoulder. After a few days, Zack seemed to admit defeat and gave up. But Zorian could see that the other boy was watching him way more closely than he did most people. Zorian's freedom to act as he saw fit was consequently somewhat limited, and he mostly amused himself with honing his shaping skills, combat magic, divinations, and spell formula. Taven was not informed of the rumors behind giant telepathic spiders in the sewers, as he didn't want to meet the Matriarch just yet. An entire restart passed in this fashion. And the next one. And the next. In total, it took 6 restarts before Zack stopped approaching him at the start of each restart and otherwise pay attention to him. Despite this, Zorian was pleased with what he had accomplished. He had spent 3 of the 6 restarts learning from the ever-enthusiastic Norabul, the other 3 restarts were spent learning from Hazlush, and had gotten skilled enough at spell formula to create a lighter, more inconspicuous version of his explosive suicide switch. It was still a cube, though a much smaller one made of a combination of wood and stone. He made 2 of them in each restart now and attached them to his key so they would appear as an ornament. He had also found a mage specializing in mind magic and had him inspect his mind for implanted compulsions and other nasty surprises. Sadly, the man was rather baffled by the memory packet and couldn't confirm it only contained memories. He did confirm, however, that it was currently dormant, and also that no other magical effect was currently active in his mind. If there was some kind of trap in the memory packet, it had yet to activate. The 7th restart saw Zack still in class, but he appeared to have finally given up on Zorian as a lost cause. It was time to get down to business. One thing Zorian found interesting about the restarts was that small, seemingly inconsequential choices exerted incredible influence on what happened in the restart. Conversely, actions that he felt should throw everything out of whack often tended to have muted, or even non-existent effects. Case in point. The last time he had gone into the sewers to meet the Matriarch, convincing Ilsa to grant him an access permit to enter the sewers had been trivial. Thus, when Zorian marched into Ilsa's office a few days after the beginning of classes, after he realized Zack had decided to give up on befriending him in this particular restart, he expected the request to be easily granted. He was wrong. No matter how much he reasoned and pleaded, Ilsa refused to allow a newly minted mage like him to risk his life in the underworld. He tried to demonstrate his, at this point rather advanced, combat magic skills, but Ilsa wasn't interested and simply shooed him out of her office. It took nearly an hour for Zorian to calm down and realize what the difference was. Last time he came with Kale, a self-taught genius mage who was also a single parent and had probably dealt with danger before in his life. If Kale thought Zorian was ready to go down into the tunnels beneath the city and was willing to accompany him to boot to make sure he was safe, then that was good enough for Ilsa. This time he came alone, though. No Kale. No permit. Not that Zorian was going to be deterred by such a minor setback. Of course. He knew at least one person who already had a permit to go down there and might be persuaded to help him. Roach. I hate you. You do know that, right? Zorian released a long-suffering sigh. opting to keep an eye on the tunnel in front of him instead of turning around to look at Taven. He didn't need to turn around to know she was making faces at him. No. Taven. I don't. After all. You only told me so 5 times already. Maybe I'll remember it if you say it a few times more. I just don't get it, Taven complained, ignoring his sarcasm. You refused to follow me down here when I asked you, saying it's too dangerous. And then you come back to me a few days later, asking me to take you into the tunnels. Yes. And he was very much regretting it. Why couldn't she have waited by the entrance like he had asked her to? He still didn't know how he was going to explain Urania to her when they found the damn spiders. Hopefully the Urania would be savvy enough to hide in the shadows while he talked to them telepathically, kind of a hassle. But should be enough to arrange a proper meeting in the future somewhere more accessible. I mean, were you trying to piss me off? Taven continued, undeterred by his lack of response. Because I'm feeling pretty angry right now. Let me tell you. Taven. Please. Zorian pleaded. I said I was sorry. How many times do I have to apologize? You of all people should understand. Considering how many times you pulled stuff like this on me. Not quite like this, Taven grumbled. At least tell me where we're going. I actually don't know, admitted Zorian. He was relying on one of the Urania scouts inadvertently contacting him by trying to read his mind. Since he had no real idea where their home territory was. I'll know it when I see it. Though. Zorian. I swear. If this is your idea of a prank. I'm totally serious, Zorian assured her. I'm pretty sure we're getting close. It shouldn't take two. An alien presence skittered across the surface of his mind, withdrawing immediately when it realized its intrusion was detected. Its telepathic touch wasn't as subtle as that of the Matriarch. But Zorian definitely received an Urania feel from it. Wait, he protested, hoping that the Urania hadn't physically fled already. I want to talk to you. Urania. I have important information for your Matriarch. Zorian. What the hell are you talking about? Taven asked, thoroughly baffled at his actions. And who are you talking to? Anyway. There is no one here. Zorian said nothing, choosing to wait in silence for a while. Seconds passed in utter silence as Zorian patiently waited for a response from the spider. Taven seemed to be torn between feeling irritation at his behavior and agitation at the potentially dangerous situation. Eventually, the Urania decided to reinitiate contact by stepping into the open right in front of him and Taven. Taven gasped in shock at the appearance of the huge hairy spider and immediately moved to draw her spell rod. Only for Zorian to snatch her by her wrist and motion her to stand down. She gave him a baffled look before glancing at the spider in front of them. The Urania stood motionless, observing them silently with its huge pitch-black eyes but not making any threatening gestures. Taven seemed to realize that the spider was no threat at the moment and relaxed, moving her hand away from the spell rod attached to her hip. Zorian, she began, radiating a mixture of anger and worry at him. I'll explain later. I promise, Zorian said with a sigh before turning to deal with the Urania. And you? Couldn't you have been a little more discreet? Why couldn't you have stayed in the shadows and contacted me telepathically? Zorian grimaced. If only it was that easy. Finding information about mind magic from his fellow mages was like pulling teeth. Since the Mage Guild took a very dim view on mind magic of any sort, no matter how benign, nobody could tell him what being psychic meant, much less teach him how to telepathically contact someone. He did track down a spell that allowed a mage to establish a telepathic connection with someone. But the spell was painfully crude. It worked only on other humans. The target had to be willing and able to lower their spell resistance. And the link only allowed word communication devoid of emotional and other connotations. I am untrained, admitted Zorian. I don't know how to contact someone telepathically. I only know how to piggyback answers on a connection someone else made. He wondered about that. Actually, nobody taught him how to do that. Yet the concept seemed to come naturally to him. Is this what it meant to be psychic? Perhaps being psychic simply meant he was some sort of instinctive mind mage with inborn skills in the field. That's so sad, the Urania said. You are incomplete. But I suppose it could always be worse. You could be a flicker mind like your friend there. What? Taven asked. Apparently having noticed his look. Nothing, Zorian mumbled. Shaking his head. Miss Urania. I err. You are a miss. Right? It was hard to tell. But he was pretty sure the Urania he was talking to had a female feel to her. Plus, the Urania were led by a matriarch. So it would make sense for outsiders like him to mostly meet the female members of the species. All Urania are female, the spider said. What? Really? Zorian asked. How on earth does that work? Do you just divide like microbes or spontaneously get pregnant or what? Nothing that exotic. It's just that our species is extremely sexually dimorphic. And the males are both smaller in stature and pretty much subsentient. We don't consider them real Urania, the spider explained. If you talk to one of us and they're smart enough to talk back, they're female. The males would probably attack you in lieu of conversation. Though you're unlikely to ever meet one unless you somehow gain access to one of our settlements. Zorian digested that information for a few moments and then decided not to ask any further questions on the topic. It was interesting. But not really relevant at the moment. And he didn't know how long he had before Taven snapped from the pressure and started throwing around spells and demanding answers. She wasn't exactly a paragon of patience. I'm sorry to be inconsiderate, but I really need to speak to the Matriarch. Zorian said. Doing his best to reproduce and send the weird Urania, Spear of Resolve, concept that the Matriarch said was her name instead of calling her the Matriarch. Hopefully this would help convince the Urania to take him seriously when he told them about memory packets from another timeline. I have been listening to your conversation with watchful eyes that miss nothing of importance for a while now. Zorian Kaczynski, the familiar presence of the Matriarch announced. Having the ability to throw your mind to any location inhabited by one of your subordinates must be really convenient. It is, confirmed the Matriarch. Now. How about you introduce yourself and tell me how you know my real name? Then we can move on to this important information you have for me. I am Zorian Kaczynski. Mage in training, Zorian said. And the reason I know your real name is that you told it to me yourself right before you shoved a memory packet into my mind and told me to give it to you later. I don't remember that, the Matriarch said hesitantly. I know, Zorian said. If you had been able to retain the memory of that encounter, you would not have bothered with putting the memory packet inside my mind. That's quite a claim, the Matriarch said after a short silence. How do I know that you're telling the truth? This could be a trap. You could be related to the people that have been sending trolls at us all this time. Honestly. I have no idea how to prove the truth of my words to you, Zorian said. Your other self was sure you would have a way to prove the authenticity of the memory packet. Even without additional proof. And didn't tell me anything I could convince you with. I see, the Matriarch said. She was silent for a few seconds as she thought it over. Give me access to your mind so I can see this memory packet for myself. Of course, Zorian said. Offering no resistance when the Matriarch delved deeper into his mind. He turned to his companion, who seemed to be at the end of her wits as she watched his silent stare down with the giant spider. Taven. I'm communicating with the spider telepathically. Everything should be fine. But if I fall to the floor and start screaming in the next few minutes, feel free to blast it to oblivion. He still had his suicide cubes with him. But it never hurt to have precautions. Taven immediately nodded at his words, and Zorian saw the Arania in front of him twitch her legs uncomfortably at the implied death threat. The matriarch said nothing, too absorbed in her work. Several minutes later, the matriarch's presence retreated from his mind. I need to think about this, the matriarch said in a daze. Come back in 3 days and we'll talk. Wait, protested Zorian. I need a way to get down here without going through any of the official entrances. Otherwise I will need to bring Taven here every time I want to come down here. And I'm not sure she'll want to talk to me after this. Zorian was immediately blasted with a mental image of the local section of the tunnel system, along with 8 different ways to access it from the surface without going through any checkpoints. Wow! People weren't kidding when they said the local underworld had more holes than a sponge. In any case, that was apparently the end of his conversation with the Arania, because the spider in front of him promptly leaped into the darkness and disappeared, leaving him alone with Taven. He cast a weary glance at said girl, only to flinch at the frown she was giving him. Okay. Now that the spider is gone, I guess you can explain to me what on earth I just took part in. Start talking, she commanded. Stupid Arania and their indiscretion. What the hell was he going to tell Taven now? Before we get to that, I would like to point out that if you had waited for me at the entrance like I asked you to. Zorian. Just saying, said Zorian lightly. Okay. Here's the thing. I'm an empath. Do you know what that means? Not really, Taven said slowly. It means I can sense other people's emotions, said Zorian. And sadly, the ability is currently an instinctive ability. I have no conscious control over it. And it often causes problems for me. So I have been looking for help in mastering it. Sadly, I have found no one willing to help me on the human side. So I broadened my horizons. The spider you saw was an Arania, a sentient, telepathic species of spiders that I hope to talk into teaching me how to control my powers. Taven stared at him for a few moments, opening her mouth at one point only to simply close it soon afterwards. And what did they say? She finally asked. They'll think about it, Zorian shrugged. Taven shook her head in disbelief and started walking toward the exit, motioning him to follow. Let's get out of here. Monster Charmer, she said. We should discuss things somewhere else. Somewhere I can sit down and have a drink. He followed, true to her words. Taven led him into an open-air tavern so they could sit down and relax while they talked. Well, so she could sit down and relax. Zorian didn't find the experience all that fun, especially since she made him pay for her drinks out of his own pocket. Strangely enough, Taven accepted most of his explanation without complaints, finding his decision to seek help from a species of monstrous spiders ballsy, rather than reckless and stupid. But things degraded from there. She was displeased that he had originally planned to meet with the Arania without backup and wanted to know whether he had done things like that before. And who had watched his back if he had. That kick-started a heated argument about the wisdom and necessity of going solo and his ability to fight his way out should things ever go sour. Zorian honestly didn't know whether she was upset because he was putting himself in danger, or that he hadn't invited her along with him. Probably the latter, since she quickly started insisting he should take her with him next time he went into the sewers to meet the Arania matriarch. She'd only get in the way and try to get him to spill his secrets to her. So he refused. Taven didn't like that at all, but seemed to realize nothing would be gained by pressing the issue directly. Instead, she switched tracks and suggested she should help him develop his combat magic. Zorian knew this was a trap, that she simply wanted to wipe the floor with him in a friendly spar in order to show him how overmatched he was against a serious opponent, and thus be more amenable to take her along like she asked, but he agreed anyway. He was curious how long he would last against her. And he had nothing to lose except perhaps his pride. That was how he found himself facing Taven in her family training hall, fingering his rod of magic missiles and trying to decide how to approach this practice spar. The training hall was, according to Taven, heavily warded to protect people inside from spell damage. But usage of lethal spells was still not recommended. Sadly. While the ban on lethal spells was totally sensible for a spar, it completely eliminated a lot of his arsenal. He never really put much thought towards battles that weren't the kill or be killed sort. So his spell choices tended towards the destructive end of the scale. "I see you invested into a spell rod," Taven said with a confident smile. "Must have cost you quite a few pieces." Left unsaid, but heard loud and clear, was the implication that the money was wasted. Zorian had no chance in hell of overwhelming Taven's defenses with magic missiles. And they both knew it. That's why he didn't even intend to try getting into a battle of attrition with someone who had bigger mana reserves than he did. Was a fool's game. The prominently displayed spell rod was a deception, intended to give Taven the wrong idea about his opening moves. His real ace in the hole was the shielding bracelet hidden under his right sleeve. "I made it myself," Zorian said. "So it didn't cost me anything." "Really?" Taven said, surprised. "I had no idea you were that good at spell formula. I mean, I knew you were interested in them. But you have your talent for combat and I have mine," Zorian said smugly. He was quite pleased with himself for getting so good at spell formula. Not only was this something he had been interested in since before the time loop, it was also something that could easily ensure his financial independence once he found a way out of the time loop. Spell formula were widely known to be a difficult field to master, and experts in the field were well paid for their services. Zorian was already good enough that he could start taking commissions today if he was so inclined, and would only get better as he went through the restarts. Whatever. In the end, you are overmatched even in the equipment department. "Despite your fancy self-made spell rod," said Taven, stretching her hand to the side of her and causing a staff mounted on the nearby wall to fly straight into her palm. He knew it was a spell staff even before Taven channeled a burst of mana into it and caused a series of glowing yellow lines to light up across its surface. "Show off," he said. He was definitely learning how to do that himself one of these days. "Ready?" Taven asked, pointing the staff threateningly towards him. "Ready," confirmed Zorian, twirling the spell rod in his hand. Taven reacted immediately, sending a small missile swarm consisting of 5 magic missiles at him. She was fast. Far faster than him. And Zorian could see in her face that she considered herself already victorious. "You are way too presumptuous, Taven," he thought, raising the hand that held the spell rod in order to erect a shield in front of him while throwing a vial full of white liquid at her with his other hand. The missile swarm crashed into Zorian's shield like a hammer. If Taven had been facing old Zorian, the one that existed before the time loop, then this would have been the end. Any shield he may have erected to defend himself would have been sloppily done and would have broken like glass under the onslaught. But she wasn't. She was facing Zorian the time traveler, who had spent quite a lot of time repeating this month. Almost 2 years. By his count. In the grand scheme of things, 2 years was not a huge amount of time. Nonetheless, that was still 2 years of continual combat magic practice. Most of it focused on a handful of spells including shield. His shield spell was nearly flawless. The plane of force was practically invisible when not under strain, and Zorian could overcharge it a great deal to strengthen it further. The shield held The missile swarm crashed against it ineffectually, causing the nigh-invisible surface to turn opaque under the strain but doing little else of note. Before Taven could collect her wits and try another attack, Zorian sent a mana pulse at the vial flying towards her. The vial shattered in midair, as if crushed by some unseen fist, and a thick white smoke billowed forth from the spot as the liquid turned to gas. The vial wasn't anything special, just a simple alchemical mixture that caused coughing fits in whomever inhaled it. But it was enough to incapacitate Taven, who stumbled out of the smoke dazed and off guard. Zorian mercilessly used her moment of weakness to send a smasher straight into her torso, hoping that was the end of the fight but half expecting Taven to throw a shield at the last second to save herself. Something, perhaps his empathy, warned him to dodge when Taven suddenly thrust her staff towards the incoming missile, and by extension, him. It was a good thing he did. Because she didn't cast a shield, she launched a massive battering ram of force that batted his attack aside like a snowflake and continued towards him unimpeded. Sadly, his dodge was only partial, and while he avoided the main thrust of the attack, he was still caught in the outer area of effect. The attack sent him spinning like a rag doll, and he soon found himself crashing headfirst into the cold, unforgiving floor of the training hall. It was probably only because of the cushioning wards in the room that he didn't end up with a cracked head or a concussion at the end of it, since Taven seemed to be more interested in coughing her lungs out than trying to finish the fight. He remained on the floor for a while, waiting for his head to stop spinning. Apparently he made the coughing gas a bit stronger than he intended. He laboriously climbed back to his feet and walked towards the recovering Taven. "You have a very strange definition of non-lethal," he told her. "Serves you right. You cough cheater," she growled. "I got you good though. Didn't I?" Zorian smiled. She huffed and swung her staff at him lightly, obviously expecting him to dodge the slow-moving object. In the interest of showing off, Zorian erected a shield instead, causing the staff to bounce off and wrench itself out of her hand. Taven looked at the shield curiously and gave it a couple of good hard knocks. The plane of force didn't even turn opaque, much less give way to her hits. "What the hell is that shield of yours made of, anyway?" Taven asked. "It took 5 missiles without breaking and it looks different. It's almost entirely transparent. I can see it only because I'm standing so close to you at the moment. Back when we were fighting, I didn't even see it until my attack hit. I thought you were trying to shield yourself with your hand or something at first. It's just a shield spell. Just greatly overcharged and superbly executed," said Zorian. "I spent a lot of time practicing that spell." "Still wouldn't have helped you without that stupid trick you pulled," Taven scoffed. "This was supposed to be a spell battle. Damn it. You said you wanted to see how I fight," Zorian shrugged. "By the way, how did you know where to fire that attack of yours? You had your eyes shut pretty tight from what I could see." "Oh. That's just a little trick one of my teachers taught me," Taven said. "I doubt it would help you much, though it's pretty wasteful in terms of mana usage." "What do you mean?" Zorian asked. "Well, it's a pretty simple move that involves expelling a large quantity of mana and saturating the area around you with it. You can then sort of sense your surroundings through the resulting mana cloud. The information you gain is very rudimentary, but you can easily spot concentrated mana constructs like that magic missile you threw at me. I actually didn't know where you were, even with the aid of the mana cloud. But I figured that if I aimed in the direction from which the attack came from, I'd probably catch you as well." That sounded awfully familiar. Zorian was pretty sure he used the exact same thing for his secret unlocking trick, except that he focused more on using the mana cloud as an extension of his tactile sense rather than perceiving mana sources. Of course, there was quite the difference in scale from flooding a lock with his mana to saturating the entire greater area around him. He simply couldn't afford to be that wasteful with his mana. However, Taven, he began. Let's say for a moment that I saturate a largish bubble of air around my head with this method. Would I be able to sense mana-charged marbles within that volume with this method? Taven blinked and gave him a curious look. I suppose. You'd probably have to spend some time mastering the skill to get a cloud sensitive enough to detect such low-powered sources. Though. But it would be easier than trying to sense mana-charged marbles with my inborn mana sense alone. Right? Zorian pressed. Way easier, Taven confirmed. Actually. Just about any method would have been easier than that. Gods. You'd have to be. I don't know. Archmage level good or something to sense a mana source that weak with no spells or other aids. Zorian suddenly felt incredibly stupid. Of course Svim's task seemed impossibly difficult, he was doing it wrong. Svim probably expected him to use a method like this to sense the marbles. The asshole just didn't bother giving him proper instructions on how to go about doing it. Or any sort of instructions. For that matter. Gods. He hated that man. Following an argument about who won their little spar, Zorian claimed it was a draw. Taven claimed she totally won in the end. Taven insisted on more fights to resolve the issue. And Zorian saw no reason to refuse. He lost all subsequent fights. Of course Taven was strong enough to simply overpower him if she so chose, and he no longer had the element of surprise on his side. Still. He felt he had done well. Since Taven actually had to work to bring him down. Even she admitted that if he caught his opponent off guard and was ruthless enough in his opening moves, he could bring down even professional battle mages. Though she warned that he could easily get in legal trouble that way. The Mage Guild looked very dimly on people who escalated fighting into the lethal realm. Even in self-defense. And anyway. Finding out what exactly Svim expected of him made the whole thing worth it all on its own. Most of the skill was already familiar to him. So it only took a few hours until he was able to create a diffuse mana cloud around his head. Granted. He couldn't really feel mana sources as such. But a marble was a physical object as well. Thus. When Friday came around and Svim unveiled his oh-so-clever training method to him. Zorian calmly identified where the marbles were going as they zipped around, and occasionally at his head. Svim wasn't impressed. Of course. He simply started throwing a quick succession of marbles at him and demanded that he sort them by magnitude of mana emissions. Which he couldn't do. Of course. Since he was sensing them by more rudimentary means. Oh well. He wasn't too concerned now that he knew what to do. He fully expected to master the skill properly soon enough. Possibly by the end of the restart. Unless Zack decided to tackle another dragon or something similarly insane. Fortunately. Zack's primary interest at the moment was trying to organize some kind of mother of all parties that involved inviting the entire class to his mansion during the summer festival. Being aware of the time loop. Zorian was one of the few people who understood what Zack was doing. He was trying to get as many students as possible out of harm's way without having to explain anything to them. Zorian had no idea what Zack planned to do with all those people when the attack started. Or how he intended to deal with Ilsa and her insistence that everyone must attend the school dance. 3 days went by. And Zorian was back in the sewers. Finding Arania proved very easy. Since they were expecting him this time. Any doubts about whether or not he was going to be taken seriously were wiped out when the forward scout he met took him to a familiar figure. The Matriarch had decided to talk to him in person. Rather than simply project her mind through one of her subordinates. Well. I have had time to digest the memories my other self sent me, the Matriarch began. The story is not as implausible as you might think. And the memories contain some pretty damning proof. I suppose we should swap stories now. No. Of your experiences. I only know the basics you told your friends. And you know precious little of why I'm not scoffing at the idea of time travel. I suppose that would make sense, Zorian said carefully. But you want me to go first, the matriarch surmised. Very well. First thing you should know is that my web has been in a conflict with your so-called invaders for several months now. They were an infuriating but manageable opponent up until a week ago, when they suddenly developed a disturbing amount of precognition about our tactics and abilities. They had counters for secret skills that have been passed on from matriarch to matriarch for generations and have never been used within living memory up until that moment. They had counters for personal abilities that were unique to a single Arania. They even seemed to know how we were going to react in response to their increased threat and aggressive moves. In short, the amount of insight they possessed about us was downright implausible. Believe it or not, time travel was seriously discussed as a possible method they were using to obtain their information. Not divinations? Zorian asked. We know divinations. Child, the matriarch said. If there is a field of magic beside the mind arts that we excel at, it is that. It is good that you mention divinations, though, because they hold a piece of the puzzle as well. You see, our web routinely tries to forecast the future with divination. With varying amount of success, highly disruptive events tend to make any future forecasts useless. What do you think happened when we tried to forecast the future during the past week? It didn't work, guessed Zorian. Oh, it worked. It gave wildly different results every time we repeated the forecast. No matter how little time passed between one forecast to the next. But it worked. So long as we didn't try to extend the forecast beyond the day of the summer festival. Beyond that date, the forecast returns a blank. Each and every time. It is as if everything beyond that date simply ceases to exist. Zorian swallowed heavily. He had often wondered what happened to everything when the time loop restarted itself, but had ultimately dismissed the question as unknowable. He didn't know whether to be relieved that he had no need to worry about leaving a soulless corpse in some alternate reality or disturbed that everything was literally being deleted when the time loop reset. I'm surprised I hadn't heard about that, he remarked. You'd think that some of the human oracles would have noticed something like that. You underestimate the difficulty of future forecasting, the matriarch said. It takes quite a bit of skill to read the future. And the process is time-consuming and tedious. It doesn't help that the results are often useless or worse, misleading. And even if you do bother to forecast the future, odds are that you're only doing it for a few days at the time. Since the predictions get more and more unreliable the further you try to extend the predictions. I hear complaints that such forecasts are a waste of time all the time from my fellow Arania. And our oracles can actually achieve a small measure of accuracy in their predictions. Still, I imagine you're right, there are probably human organizations that have run the forecasts and encountered the same thing, but are keeping quiet for a variety of reasons. Nobody likes a doomsayer well. Nobody of any authority. In any case, it would be nice to have independent confirmation of our findings. But I suspect few diviners would feel comfortable with sharing their secrets with a bunch of giant spiders. Perhaps if a certain young mage with an interest in divinations were to talk to them. I'll see what I can do, said Zorian. I'll give you a list of names, the matriarch said. Now how about you give us some details about the time loop and your experiences in it? Zorian gave them a basic rundown of the situation, leaving out many of the details he considered irrelevant and a tad too personal. The matriarch had only given him the bare-bones version of their story as well, so he didn't feel too bad about that. That bond between you and Zack is really inconvenient, the matriarch remarked. I don't blame you for not taking a chance with it. But are you sure you can't talk to Zack without triggering it? Who knows what useful things the boy knows about this whole thing? Surely if you inform him of your fears he will agree to keep his distance. Zorian wasn't nearly so sure. He knew Zack meant well. But he always did have problems with patience and self-control. And none of his previous encounters with the boy convinced him he'd changed all that much in that regard. Zack would have probably found another time traveler immensely fascinating and kept pushing at the boundaries until the soul bond either activated fully or was shown to be harmless. I'm surprised you haven't already ripped the knowledge from his mind, Zorian remarked. Isn't he a heir? Flickermind. He isn't psychic. But he does have some skill in shielding his mind, the matriarch said. Not at all ashamed to admit she had already tried to steal his memories. Not well. But enough that I can't do more than read his surface thoughts. Now stop dodging the question. Zorian sighed. Everything I found out about soul bonds suggests that there probably isn't any bond between me and Zack. Soul bonds tend to be really obvious to even basic detection spells. My divination instructor in one of the previous restarts showed me a spell for detecting soul bonds and I used it in school a few times. Every student with a familiar is clearly connected to their partner. And the two soul-bonded twins are also clearly bonded to each other. There is absolutely no link between me and Zack that I can see. There is no way an accidental side effect of an offensive soul mutilation spell has such sophisticated effects when even properly created soul bonds light up easily on detection spells. Curious, the matriarch said. What is it? If not a soul bond. Though. Kale thinks that when the soul merge was terminated by our deaths. The link between us was cut rather than carefully untangled. As a consequence, a piece of Zack's soul ended up fused to mine. And the reverse is probably true for Zack. The control function of the time loop probably got confused at that point. And rather than decide which one of us is the real Zack decided to simply loop both of us. That would explain why Zack was absent during the first few restarts. And why he was so very sick when he finally did show up, the matriarch said. You probably both spent a number of restarts in a coma while your souls healed and integrated all the foreign bits. But he probably drew the short end of the straw when the spell was cut and ended up with far more soul damage than you. It would, agreed Zorian. And honestly, it's the most plausible explanation I've got. So why don't you want to talk to Zack? Then, the matriarch asked. Oh. I see the third time traveler. Yes. It's pretty obvious at this point that there is at least one more person inside the time loop besides me and Zack. That someone is aiding the invaders and has gods know how big of a lead on me in terms of time spent in the time loop. So I definitely don't want to catch their attention. And they know of Zack. I mean, they have to. He really isn't all that secretive about his status as a time traveler and his activities. But they aren't doing anything about it. Zack is clearly trying to fight the invaders. So why leave him unmolested? Because his actions don't matter in the long run, the matriarch guessed. From what you told me, he's trying to become strong enough to personally contest the entire invasion force. There is not much chance of that happening. Even if he has all the time in the world to prepare. That. And he's possibly already been neutralized, Zorian said. I'm pretty sure that Zack is the key figure in this time travel business, the original time traveler. He has too much potential in terms of money, family legacy, mana reserves and so on. He could benefit from the whole time loop setup better than virtually anyone else. And I don't think it's accidental. Furthermore, if I am indeed in this time loop because I have a piece of Zack's soul fused to mine, that means it's him the time loop recognizes as the legitimate focus of the spell. The thing is, his past actions indicate ignorance of any sort of purpose or master plan. As if he had simply been dumped into the loop with no warning or information. You think his memories have been edited, surmised the Urania. I think Zack entrusted his secret to the wrong person, Zorian said. They couldn't just get rid of Zack as I said. He is the key to this spell, but they could eliminate him as a threat. Shift his attention in a harmless direction and so on. But I'm not Zack. I am not integral to this time loop in any way. And can be disposed of at whim. If I talk to Zack. And he's being watched. Or if Zack is unable to keep his mouth shut in front of the wrong people. I could end up being deleted. Well, the Matriarch said. You're certainly one paranoid human. Then again. That might be the only reason why you're still in possession of your entire memory. So maybe I shouldn't talk. You do realize you're going to have to talk to Zack at some point. Right? Hopefully not before I identify the third time traveler, Zorian said. Then we should make it a priority to track him down, the Matriarch said. How? Zorian asked. I don't even know where to start. It could be anyone. Considering you said Zack managed to kill Oldo Ganj single-handedly. It is clearly not anyone. He wasn't always that strong. Though, Zorian pointed out. In the first few restarts. Any decent mage could have overpowered him. Even some of our classmates. For that matter. It could be a matter of backstabbing rather than losing in combat. Someone could have drugged him or lured him into a heavily warded trap area. Even a classmate. You say? The Matriarch asked speculatively. That's interesting. Didn't you say Zack is fairly obsessed with learning more about the rest of your class? He would probably think nothing of sharing a secret with one of them. Especially since they're just students. How well do you know them as a whole? Are any of them acting strange? I'm not really very close to any of them, Zorian admitted. I don't think I would know if they started behaving strangely. So long as they didn't go completely out of character. I can think of a few that I'm sure aren't time travelers, but try to investigate, the Matriarch said. It would be terribly embarrassing if it turns out the third one was hiding in plain sight all along. No. Try to see if you can connect any of them with the invaders as well. The Matriarch gave Zorian a list of human diviners that might know more about the irregularities related to future forecasting, and they both agreed to meet in another 3 days. Zorian was a bit annoyed that the topic of his empathy and getting it under control never came up, but he supposed the Matriarch wanted to see how useful to them he was before investing their time to teach him their, possibly secret, mind arts. It was nice having someone on his side in this whole tangled mess. He just hoped he wasn't making the same mistake with the Urania that Zack did with the person behind the invasion. Zorian didn't like temples. Partially it was due to his bad experiences with them as a child. But mostly due to his inability to understand the reverence with which the priesthood spoke of the vanished gods they were supposed to be venerating. Virtually every story he had read or heard about the Age of Gods made the divinities sound like gigantic jerks. So why would anyone want them back? Nobody could ever give him a satisfactory answer to that question. Least of all his parents. Who were religious only so long as the neighbors were watching. The temple in front of which he was standing at the moment did nothing to dispel that unease. The large dome-like building on the outskirts of Scioria was larger and far more imposing than any other temple Zorian had previously been in. Despite being described as one of the smaller ones in Scioria. Still, the Urania Matriarch had claimed this temple housed the best, human, future forecaster in the city. So his unease would have to be set aside for the sake of accomplishing the mission. He hesitantly stepped towards the heavy wooden doors that served as an entrance to the temple. Warily glancing at the huge stone angels that flanked the doorway. Lifelike and grim-faced. The angels appeared to gaze down on him as he approached. Judging him and finding him lacking. Try as he might. Zorian couldn't completely dismiss his unease with the statues. Since there was a very real possibility they were guardian golems or some other sort of security. He was just about to open the door and walk inside when he noticed a series of images carved into the door and paused to study them. Although the carvings on the door were fairly stylized and disjointed. He recognized instantly what they were about. They formed a crude sort of comic, depicting a familiar story of how the world was created according to Icosians, and by extension, most religions drawing their traditions from them. According to Icosians, the world was originally a swirling, shapeless chaos, inhabited only by the 7 primordial dragons. One day, the gods descended from the higher planes of existence and killed all of them save one. This last one they refashioned into the material world that humans now inhabit, turning her body into dirt and stone, her blood into water, her breath into air, and her fire into magic. The vast networks of tunnels stretching beneath the surface of the world are dragon veins, now empty of blood that had been turned into the seas but still flooded with magic emanating from the heart of the world, the fiery, still beating heart of the primordial dragon that rests somewhere deep underground. Far from being content with her fate, the world dragon still rages against her bounds, giving birth to natural disasters like volcanoes and earthquakes. Unable to strike back against the gods themselves, the dragon takes her anger out on their favored creations, humans, by utilizing her heart, the one thing the gods have not seen fit to take away from her. Pieces of it continually flake off from the main mass, giving birth to horrifying monsters whenever they hit the ground. At which point said monsters begin their ascent to the surface to terrorize mankind. And so on. Zorian didn't believe there was much truth in the old story, but the whole thing was pretty horrifying if one took it at face value. With gods like that, it was no wonder the old faiths were steadily losing converts to new religions that popped up after the gods disappeared. "Can I help you with something, young man?" Zorian wrenched himself from his musings to look at the man who spoke to him. He found himself facing a young, green-haired man in priestly robes. The man's relaxed posture and friendly smile set Zorian at ease. But he couldn't help but wonder about that green hair. As far as Zorian knew, the only people who naturally had green hair were members of House Reed. And it seemed rather out of character for one of them to go into clergy. That particular house was infamous for their links to crime syndicates. "Maybe," allowed Zorian. "I am Zorian Kaczynski, mage in training. I was wondering whether Priestess Kylie was around and willing to talk to me." "Oh. And sorry about worrying you. I suppose I had been staring at the entrance a little too long." Junior Priest Batak, the man introduced himself. "And don't worry. A lot of people are intimidated by the gates. It's why I like to greet newcomers personally like this. As for Kylie, well, she is currently in the middle of a ritual. But if you're willing to wait an hour or so, I'm sure she'll be happy to hear you out." "Sure," Zorian agreed. This was far better than he expected. To be honest, he half expected the man to put him through some kind of religious test before allowing him to see the head priestess. Waiting an hour or two was a minor price to pay, really. So should I come back later or? "Nonsense," the man scoffed. "Come inside and I'll make us something to drink while we wait. It'll be nice to have someone new to chat with for a change. We get so few visitors these days." Oh. It seemed that he might still end up being subjected to a test. Only this one in the form of casual conversation instead of something overt. "Slow week?" Zorian asked as they entered the temple. The interior was pleasantly cool and fairly dark, with rays of multicolored light streaming down from several high-placed stained glass windows, as well as totally empty. He was grateful for the lack of crowds, but it was unusual to see a temple completely deserted like this. "I wish," Batak sighed. He led Zorian through rows and rows of wooden benches that filled the temple's main hall, his steps echoing hauntingly behind him. More like a slow decade. The aftermath of the weeping has not been kind to this place. "What do you mean?" Zorian asked. "What does the weeping have to do with this place?" Batak gave him a judging glance before sighing heavily. Though the gods have gone silent, the priesthood has never been completely powerless. Most priests have some skill with magic, and higher ranks can usually call upon the aid of angels and other lesser spiritual entities. But our real claim to authority came from various hidden mysteries that were entrusted to us before the gods departed to the unknown. Over time a lot of those were stolen or otherwise lost. But the one thing where we were always unmatched was the healing arts. As such, when the weeping plague started spreading across the lands like wildfire, we were expected to do something about it. Sadly, not only were we as powerless against it as anyone else, our close contact with the infected quickly resulted in massive casualties within our ranks. With the subsequent shortage of qualified priests, peripheral temples like this one were all but abandoned, both by believers and by the Holy Triumvirate. Zorian looked around him, but failed to see any evidence of decay in the interior of the temple. The temple was clean and intact, and the altar made out of white marble and framed with silk or some other expensive cloth looked practically brand new. Plenty of stone statues were scattered throughout the building, seamlessly melding into the walls or support beams. And most of the remaining unadorned space was taken up by wooden panels that had various religious imagery carved into their surface, much like the main doors. In short, it was an absurdly luxurious building by the standards of rural temples such as the one in Siren, and better maintained to boot. Zorian was almost afraid to ask what Sioria's main temple looked like if this one was not considered important enough to keep running. Batak led him to a small, unassuming door next to the altar and ushered him to what was apparently a more informal setting. Rather than being a classical office, it was instead a combination of a kitchen and a living room. Far messier then and not nearly as lifeless as the main temple had been. Batak immediately started preparing some tea and started peppering him with questions. The questions were fairly standard: who he was, what he did, where he was from, who his family was. That sort of stuff, so Zorian felt comfortable answering them honestly. Strangely enough, Batak didn't ask him a single question about his religiosity. Something Zorian was glad for. Zorian, in turn, asked a couple of questions about Batak and Kylie, trying to understand what they were even doing here if the temple was abandoned. Batak was all too happy to enlighten him. Apparently the church leadership didn't feel comfortable with simply demolishing the temple or worse, leaving it to the mercy of the elements and looters. A perfectly understandable sentiment. In Zorian's opinion, not only would it be a shame to consign such a majestic building to oblivion, it would also be a blatant admission of weakness from the church. In the end, Batak and Kylie were assigned to the temple, ostensibly to keep the temple running but in reality more to keep it presentable and ward off thieves and squatters. Finally, after he finished his cup of tea, Batak finally decided he had danced around the issue long enough. So, said Batak, you never did tell me why you're here. Mr. Kaczynski, do you think you could perhaps tell me what you need to speak with Kylie about, or is this too sensitive for the ears of a mere junior priest? Zorian thought about it for a second before deciding it probably wouldn't hurt to tell the man why he came. Future forecasting wasn't illegal or anything. After all. Well, began Zorian. For a start, I heard that Priestess Kylie is skilled at forecasting the future through divinations. Batak stiffened slightly, but quickly forced himself to relax. His smile did slip off his face. However, she is, he said. It is a difficult field to practice and I doubt anyone could claim mastery of it in any real sense. But she is as close to an expert as you're likely ever going to get. But there are other people who dabble in it regardless. One of which has sent me to speak with Kylie about her findings, said Zorian. privately enjoying the mental image of the Urania matriarch hissing at him for calling her a dabbler in the field. Some of the results she had gotten out of her predictions have been very irregular. All pretenses of good cheer had left Batak's face by the time he finished talking. Silence stretched into uncomfortable seconds. Zorian was starting to wonder if talking about the topic was somehow taboo or if he had otherwise insulted the man somehow when the junior priest spoke again. And these irregularities, when exactly do they appear? How far did your mysterious backer project her predictions before they went haywire? It was at this point that Zorian realized, Batak already knew. He was no more a mere junior priest than Zorian was just an innocent messenger. There is only one real irregularity. And it appears on the day of the summer festival. Specifically, the prediction returns a blank beyond that date, almost as if the whole world disappears after that point. But you already knew that. Didn't you? Asked Zorian rhetorically. Instead of answering him, Batak spat out a very unpriestly curse and started pacing around the cramped room in agitation. I'll take that as a yes, Zorian sighed. Batak stopped pacing to give him a wary look. After a few moments, the priest visibly forced himself to relax. I'm sorry, said Batak. I didn't mean to be rude. It's just, well, it's probably best if I go and fetch Kylie now so we can discuss this together. Isn't she doing a ritual at the moment? Zorian pointed out curiously. He knew it was a very bad idea to stop magical rituals halfway through. But maybe the ritual Kylie was performing was purely religious in nature. Well, sort of, Batak said sheepishly. I don't think she'll be terribly bothered if I interrupt her. Not for this. In any case, please wait here while I go get her. As Zorian watched Batak hurriedly leave, he couldn't help but wonder why Batak was so spooked out by the termination date they uncovered. Zorian was certainly spooked. But that was because he knew exactly what was causing it. But to Batak and Kylie it shouldn't look terribly unusual. Much like soul-related magics, the field of future prediction was very poorly understood. And strange never-encountered events probably weren't unheard of. Zorian sincerely hoped that Batak's agitation meant they knew something important about the anomaly that he and Urania Matriarch had missed. It wasn't long before Batak came back with a middle-aged woman back in tow. Zorian's first thought was that she was surprisingly young for a high priestess. But he supposed with the manpower shortage among the priesthood they couldn't afford to be too picky about such things. For her part, the priestess gave him a long, searching look upon entering the room before giving him a strained smile and sitting down next to Batak. So that both of them were facing him. Hello, Mr. Kaczynski, she said. I am Kylie Kwosi, the high priestess of this temple. I hear you've wanted to speak to me. Specifically, that you wanted to speak to me about future prediction. About the termination date on the day of the summer festival. Yes, Zorian confirmed. A short exchange followed where they both confirmed they were indeed talking about the same thing, and then the priestess leaned back on her chair and gave Batak a mild glare. I told you it was not a mistake, she said. And I told you it wasn't you who was the problem, Batak shot back. I guess we were both right. Kylie sighed before refocusing on Zorian. I don't suppose you could introduce me to your master so I can discuss this directly with her. Not that I have anything against you, but you just don't have the necessary expertise and all your information is by necessity secondhand. Sorry, Zorian said. I'm afraid my master definitely wishes to stay hidden. I agree she could help you better in person. But this is how things are at the moment. And it was vanishingly unlikely that would change any time soon. According to current church dogma, Urania were classified as monster servants of the world dragon. To be precise, and therefore not to be dealt with. Kylie and Batak seemed fairly liberal as priests go. But probably not that liberal. Admitting he was speaking on behalf of a giant sentient spider would have led to him being forcibly expelled from the temple at best. If I may ask, though, why has this gotten you so spooked? Zorian asked curiously. I mean, I know why me and my master are concerned. But why do you have a problem with it? The priestess looked at him curiously. And why are you concerned? If I may ask. Trade, offered Zorian, suppressing a smile in favor of a most innocent expression he could manage. Hook, line and sinker. The priestess shared a silent look with Batak, somehow communicating without words with her fellow priest. Apparently they knew each other quite well if they could manage that. Maybe they were lovers. If Zorian remembered correctly, priests were forbidden to have relationships with each other, and thus had to look for romantic options outside the church hierarchy. But it wouldn't be the first time such rules were ignored. In any case, after a few seconds they seemed to reach a decision and turned again towards him. We will share our concerns with you. But only if you go first, the priestess said. And be warned, I can tell when people lie to me. It is a supernatural ability and has never failed me before. So please don't waste my time with lies and half-truths. Well, that was kind of inconvenient. Zorian didn't detect any attempt at barging into his mind. So whatever ability she had probably wasn't mind-based in nature. Was she instinctively divining the truth of his statements? Peering into his soul? He supposed she could be bluffing. But he somehow doubted it. In the end he decided to take a risk. He fired off a couple of divinations to make sure they weren't scryed and that there were no cephalic rats around, and then started to speak when they returned negative. Let's see if this will be a sufficient price for your help. Then, Zorian sighed. The reason we're concerned is that there is a well-funded, well-organized group of terrorists planning to take advantage of the summer festival to cause trouble. Some parts of their plan, like their usage of artillery spells and war trolls smuggled through the dungeon, was fairly pedestrian. But there is a more exotic component to their plans, one that wreaks havoc with future prediction by its very nature. There was a brief moment of silence as the two priests stared at him incredulously. That is not what I expected to hear, the priestess said. Gods and goddesses. This is way above my pay grade. I don't think I want to know more. To be honest, I don't want to get involved into such things. Probably for the best, Zorian agreed. If that is indeed the true cause of the irregularity, though, then my own reasons to panic about it are largely misplaced, the priestess mused. I'd still like to hear about it. If it's not a problem, Zorian said. It's about the angels, Batak interjected. Ever since the gods have gone silent, angels have sort of taken their place. They can't grant magical powers to the priesthood or work miracles the way gods could. But they can be summoned in order to provide advice or give aid with their considerable personal abilities. And what did they say about the anomaly that got you so spooked? Zorian asked curiously. That's the thing, the priestess sighed. We can't ask them because no one has been able to summon them since about a week ago. We've been in contact with churches as far as Koth. And they report the same thing. Even the most approachable of celestials are ignoring us. Hell, I've even heard rumors that demon worshippers cannot contact their vile masters anymore. It is as if something has cut the entire material plane off from the spiritual realms. Zorian swallowed heavily. A week ago, the start of the time loop, obviously. Quite disturbing. Isn't it? Said Kylie. Coupled with the timeline simply cutting off a few weeks from now. Well, I must admit it had really gotten me spooked. Finding out the two are basically unrelated certainly makes me rest easier. There was further conversation after this. But none of it was terribly productive. He promised Batak and Kylie to be discreet about their troubles with contacting the spirit world and left. Unlike the priestess, Zorian didn't feel like the conversation had eased his worries. Following his visit to the temple, Zorian decided to sit down in one of the many restaurants scattered throughout the city and consider this new information with a bit of food and drink. There was no doubt in his mind that the severing of the link between the spiritual planes and the material one was caused by the time loop. But what that meant was less clear. Was the material plane the only one experiencing the time loop, isolated from everything else within some kind of time bubble? The fact that his current timeline seemed to literally end when the time loop restarted strongly suggested this. Apparently the spell wasn't snatching up a bunch of souls and putting them into their past bodies like he initially assumed. It was literally rewinding time itself in the targeted area while leaving a couple of souls intact in the process. No wonder the spell was so easily transmissible compared to reverting everything 1 month into the past. The cost of looping an additional soul or two was probably utterly inconsequential. And that, if true, was very disturbing. That was not human magic. 100 or so mages in possession of a mana. Well, and a whole lot of time to prepare could affect a medium-sized country at most. The time loop must have enveloped the whole continent. At least, for the boundary to have not been noticed after a day or two. News spread fast these days. And frankly, Zorian had a hunch the time loop enveloped the entire planet. This was like something straight out of the Age of Gods, but if higher beings were involved. Why was the time loop allowed to go off its intended course so severely? His musings were interrupted by the scraping of a nearby chair. Someone had decided to join him. "Oh," he said. "It's you. Is that the way to greet a friend?" "Roach," Taven complained. Zorian rolled his eyes at her. "Hi, Taven," he said blandly. "Fancy seeing you here. I mean, this place is pretty far from your usual haunts. It's almost as if you decided to track me down to this place." "That's because I did," Taven said. "What are you doing on the edge of the city?" "Anyway, I was visiting a temple nearby," Zorian answered. "Lovely architecture." "You visiting temples?" Taven scoffed. Zorian said nothing. "Fine. Be that way. I won't pry. In case you're wondering, I'm here because I asked around to see if I could find a human empath that could help you control your powers." "You did?" asked Zorian, suddenly a lot more alert and enthusiastic about this conversation. Taven smiled sheepishly. "I kind of did find someone willing to help you. But I'm not sure whether it's something you're willing to go for. The woman in question is a healer in one of Sioria's big hospitals, and she's only willing to teach you if you agree to an apprentice contract with her and become a full-blown healer." Zorian clacked his tongue in disappointment. He did intend to learn the basics of magical healing at some point in the future. But that was a long way off. Learning medicine wasn't something you do in your spare time and would doubtlessly require him to dedicate most of the restart on mastering that one field. He had too many things on his plate as it was. "No. That doesn't work for me at all," Zorian sighed. "I have nothing against healers, but that's not the career I'm aiming for." "Yeah. I kind of figured," Taven said. "It really would be kind of a shame to let all that work you sank into spell formulas go to waste. I guess the spiders are still your best bet." "Huh. Yeah," agreed Zorian. "Although to tell the truth, they have been dragging their many feet in regard to teaching me. Maybe if they thought I actually had valid alternatives to their help they'd hurry up a little." "What was the healer's name? Anyway?" Taven narrowed her eyes. "You've been down there alone again?" "Oh. Maybe." She reached out across the table and cuffed him in the shoulder. "It hurt." "Zorian. You moron," she complained. "I told you not to do these things alone. Even if you trust the freaky giant spiders that much, and I don't really think you should, there are other things down there. No matter how capable you are. It's always smart to have another set of hands and eyes with you. Unless you think I couldn't keep up with you. I don't think that at all, Zorian said. I just didn't want to be a bother and... I already said I don't mind helping, Taven cut him off. You can't use that as an excuse. And the Urania are kind of prejudiced against non-psychic people, finished Zorian. Non-what? Asked Taven incredulously. Psychic. People who are like me and them. I don't quite have a comprehensive explanation what being psychic entails. But it seems to be some kind of instinctive affinity for mind magic. That's where my empathy apparently comes from. The Urania claim it's a weak form of mind reading. And that I could actually do more once they actually deign to teach me. Taven seemed at a loss for words for a moment. You're reading my mind, she finally said. I didn't give you permission to do that. I'm only getting vague impressions of your emotions. And not even that consistently, said Zorian with a long-suffering sigh. Besides, that's why I'm meeting with the Urania to learn how to not do that unless I want to. How did you think empathy works? Anyway. I guess I didn't, admitted Taven. But we're getting off track. Why does me not being psychic matter to your new spidery friends? How should I know? Prejudices rarely make much sense. Well, go ahead and ask them the next time you see them. Taven said. Because if you can't give me a proper answer the next time I ask, I'm going down there to ask them myself. With or without your permission. It's total bullshit. Aside from his visit to the temple, none of the other future forecasters were in any way helpful to Zorian. A fair number of them didn't even want to talk to him. And those that did hadn't made long-term predictions and hadn't noticed anything strange. Well, one of them did claim to have done so and found nothing of note. But he was an obvious fraud and spent most of the talk trying to get Zorian to part with his money in exchange for a more detailed reading of the future. So Zorian turned to the matter of his classmates and the possibility that one of them was the third-time traveler. Zorian didn't think there was much chance of that. But better safe than sorry. Besides, it was a good way to look for clues as far as he was concerned. And he had been thinking of getting to know his classmates better anyway. Including him. There were exactly 20 people in Zorian's class, 12 girls and 8 boys. Of those, there were 3 people he was almost certain weren't the third-time traveler Akoja. Benesek and Kale. The first 2 because he actually knew what their normal behavior and personality were before the time loop and had interacted extensively enough with the both of them in various restarts to judge them unchanged. And Kale because of the events that took place in the previous restart. Trying to write down everything he knew about the rest. He quickly found 2 classmates that were very suspicious, Tinami Aope and Eston Greer. Noble House Aope had a very shady reputation. The house began its existence during the Witch Wars. When one of the major witch clans agreed to defect to the Icosian side if they were given the status of a formal house in return. The Icosians. Ever pragmatic. Agreed. No doubt they thought they could milk the renegades for their magical secrets and then quietly sideline them until they could be officially removed. But that never happened. Instead, the Aope rose through the ranks of the Icosian political system, leaving a trail of broken rivals in their wake. Until they eventually stood on top as one of the more prestigious noble houses in all Altazia. This extreme success wasn't a result of just being very competent politicians. Though Aope were rumored to practice all sorts of dark, forbidden magic stemming from their witchy roots. Necromancy. Demon summoning. Mind magic. Of course. This was all just a rumor. Certainly no one who valued their life and career would ever suggest that Tinami Aope, the firstborn daughter of the current head of Aope household, was practicing forbidden magics. Perish the thought. And in fact, the girl was painfully shy and withdrawn and in general looked like she wouldn't hurt a fly. That didn't prove anything. Though. Beware of the quiet ones and all that. If there was one person in the class who had easy access to magics that could screw Zack over and hijack the time loop for their own ends, it was probably Tinami. Even better. Her withdrawn nature would ensure that very few people knew her enough to realize she was acting strangely unless she did something totally crazy. Eston Greer, the second suspect, was primarily suspicious because of where he came from. He and his family had immigrated to Altazia from Oquin-Abesa, the infamous island of the exiles. Since the island was populated mostly by mages exiled there in the wake of the Necromancer's War. That made Eston the second person who could plausibly have access to forbidden magics without too much trouble. Also, Zorian was fairly certain that the mages leading the invasion force came primarily from Oquin-Abesa. The island was one of the few places where one could find enough necromancers and war trolls to explain the numbers of them present at the invasion. It was also the last recorded home of Quatakikl, the Lich General that fought the Old Alliance in the Necromancer's War and whose physical description matched almost exactly with the Lich that had so thoroughly trounced Zack in that fateful battle where Zorian was dragged into the time loop. Of course, those two were only the obvious suspects. And the third time traveler, if indeed present among his classmates, was no doubt far more cunningly hidden. Realizing he didn't know enough about people in his class to really make a judgment, Zorian decided to seek the aid of the one person who could no doubt tell him something about everyone. "Hello, Benesek," Zorian said, sitting next to the chubby, talkative boy. "Can I ask you to do me a favor?" "Sure," Benesek said. "What do you need?" "I need basic information about everyone in our class. What's the latest gossip about them and so forth?" "Well, that is certainly an interesting turn of events," the Matriarch remarked. "A confirmation of the cutoff point in the timeline and another clue as to the true nature of this time loop is far more than I had hoped for. I must admit I hadn't actually expected you to find anything useful among human diviners. But there you go. I don't suppose you have anything on your classmates yet?" "Not really," Zorian responded. "I'm only starting with the investigation. Truthfully, this is bound to be a task spanning numerous restarts. So you shouldn't expect quick results." "Yes. Of course. Well, I have nothing else to add, so unless you have any additional questions we can meet each other next week to check on each other's progress." "Actually, I have 2 questions," said Zorian. "Ask away." Then. "First question, can you explain to me what exactly you mean by flicker mind, and why you disdain them so much?" Zorian asked. "You keep saying that word and it sounded terribly insulting and bigoted." The Matriarch twitched her legs, emitting some complex emotion that Zorian couldn't decode with his limited empathic abilities. That tended to happen a lot. Actually, since the Arania were so thoroughly different from humans in both body and mind. "I apologize if we offend," she finally said. It had been quite a while since we had a real, sustained contact with a human. And there are bound to be misunderstandings and points of contention. "I notice you didn't actually answer my question," pointed out Zorian. "It is like you suspect, a flicker mind is a creature that isn't psychic like you and me. I'm sure they can be wonderful people. But I, as well as most of my fellow Arania, find it hard to truly take them seriously. It's like meeting a society of people that are born blind. They can obviously manage without sight. But you'd probably still consider them fundamentally crippled. You never did tell me what being psychic entails." "You know," Zorian pointed out, "everything, from the smallest grain of sand to the very gods themselves, is connected through the great invisible web that suffuses all creation," the Matriarch said. "Psychic people are open to these connections, and contact the minds of others, or even the universe itself, to perform what you humans call magic." "That explanation sounds almost religious," said Zorian. The great invisible web does feature prominently in our spirituality, the matriarch admitted. What was the other question you wanted to ask me about? Ah. Yes. I had found a human empath that might be willing to teach me some of her skills. I wanted to ask you for your opinion. No, the matriarch interrupted. That's a terrible idea. Your human empaths are bad teachers. Their training consists of nothing but showing people how to shut off their link to the great web and keep it closed most of the time. They brainwash their students into believing that sensing emotions is all there is to their powers and that the rest of the mind arts are immoral. They make a mockery of the great gift. Zorian blinked in shock. He had intended to produce a reaction by broaching the topic in question. But he had no idea the matriarch would be affected this strongly. Anger and outrage simply poured off the matriarch, making it clear that she cared about this issue very much. For the first time since his first encounter with her, he remembered that she was actually quite a terrifying creature. That's a lot stronger denunciation than I expected, Zorian admitted, forcing himself to remain calm. Care to suggest an alternative? Then. I really want to get this ability under control. Have I not promised to help you with that? The matriarch asked. And then you ignored the issue completely, Zorian answered. I thought you needed time to come to terms with it. You didn't exactly act thrilled when I first informed you of your gifts. Maybe if you hadn't waited 6 months before contacting me we would have been on the same wavelength. Ouch. But no matter, the matriarch said. This whole argument is pointless. If you want to learn how to use your gift effectively, I'll be happy to help. Come back tomorrow at this time and we can begin with your lessons. She turned to leave before pausing and sending him one final parting burst of communication. And then, once you experience the great web in its full glory, you can go to that human empath and see for yourself who is right.